For thousands of years, humans have been drawn to those who claim to see what others cannot. They have traveled great distances, crossed dangerous terrain, and risked their safety to sit with prophets and seers. They have listened intently to cryptic words, vague warnings, and mysterious predictions. They have believed, and they continue to believe, even in our modern, scientifically sophisticated world. Why? What is it about prophecy that captures human imagination so powerfully that it persists across centuries and cultures despite the lack of reliable evidence? Tonight we explore one of humanity's oldest fascinations, the claim to foresee the future. We'll examine the lives and predictions of history's most famous prophets. Nostradamus, the 16th century French physician, whose cryptic quatrains are still interpreted today. Baba Vanga, the Bulgarian mystic whose followers claim she predicted major world events. Edgar Cayce, the American psychic whose readings were meticulously documented, giving us rare insight into how prophecy claims are sustained. We'll investigate what they predicted, what actually came to pass, and what failed to materialize. We'll explore the psychology behind why we believe in prophecy, the cognitive mechanisms that make vague predictions seem accurate, and what science reveals about whether the future can truly be known. This exploration is built on research from historians, psychologists, neuroscientists, and scholars who have carefully examined prophecy claims. It's grounded in evidence, in documented predictions, and in the honest acknowledgement of what we don't know. But it's also a deeply human story, a story about our fear of uncertainty, our hunger for meaning, and our desperate desire to understand what lies ahead. Over the next 2 hours and 20 minutes, we'll move through this journey thoughtfully and carefully. We'll examine specific predictions and trace how they've been interpreted over time. We'll consider the mechanisms of retrofitting, how failed predictions are reinterpreted as successes. We'll explore the science of uncertainty and why the future may be fundamentally unknowable. And we'll reflect on what prophecy reveals about human nature itself. This is not a program designed to mock those who believe in prophecy or to dismiss the human needs that prophecy addresses. Rather, it's an invitation to understand prophecy more deeply, to see it not just as a claim about the future, but as a window into how human minds work, what we fear, what we hope for, and what we're willing to believe. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this journey together. The ancient art of prophecy, how humans have sought the future. When did humans first look toward the future and wonder what might come? The answer reaches back further than written history itself. Long before we developed the tools to record our thoughts, our ancestors were already seeking ways to glimpse what lay ahead. They watched the stars, studied the patterns of animals, and listened to the voices of those they believed could perceive beyond the veil of ordinary sight. This impulse to know the unknowable, to prepare for the unprepared, is as fundamental to human nature as language itself. Prophecy in its essence is humanity's oldest conversation with uncertainty. It emerges from a simple but profound realization. We are creatures aware of our own mortality and the passage of time. Unlike other animals, we can contemplate tomorrow, imagine possibilities, and feel anxiety about what might come. This awareness creates a psychological burden unique to human consciousness. We need to believe that the future is not entirely random, that patterns exist, that someone might understand what lies ahead. Prophecy offers this comfort, whether or not it delivers accuracy. The earliest evidence of prophecy comes from ancient Mesopotamia, where the practice was woven into the fabric of daily governance and spiritual life. In the temples of Babylon and Ur, priests, known as diviners, developed sophisticated systems for reading the future. They studied the entrails of sacrificed animals, a practice called haruspicy, believing that the patterns of organs revealed messages from the gods. The liver in particular was considered a map of divine intention. Priests would examine its color, shape, and texture comparing what they saw to established patterns recorded on clay tablets. These tablets, some dating back to the 18th century BCE, represent humanity's first attempts to systematize prophecy to create a repeatable methodology for divine communication. The Mesopotamians also watched the heavens with extraordinary attention. Astronomers, or as they were known, then astrologers, tracked the movements of planets and stars, believing that celestial patterns corresponded to earthly events. When Jupiter appeared in a particular constellation, when the moon entered a certain phase, when comets streaked across the sky, these were interpreted as messages about what would happen to kings' armies and harvests. This wasn't mere superstition. These observers developed genuine astronomical knowledge. They could predict lunar eclipses and understood the cyclical nature of planetary motion. Yet they interpreted this knowledge through a spiritual lens, seeing in the mathematics the handwriting of the divine. Moving westward to ancient Greece, we encounter one of history's most famous prophetic institutions, the oracle at Delphi. Established around the 8th century BCE, the oracle became so influential that no major decision in the Greek world was made without consulting her. Kings and generals would travel to the sanctuary of Apollo, climbing the mountain to the temple where the oracle, a woman known as the Pythia, sat in a sacred chamber. The process was ritualized and elaborate. The Pythia would enter a trance state, often described as ecstatic possession, and speak in fragmented utterances that priests would then interpret and translate into verse. These prophecies were notoriously ambiguous. When King Croesus asked whether he should go to war, the oracle replied that if he did, a great empire would fall. Croesus attacked, and indeed an empire fell his own. The ambiguity was not a flaw but a feature. It allowed the prophecy to be reinterpreted after events, maintaining the oracle's reputation regardless of outcome. What made Delphi remarkable was not just the prophecies themselves, but their cultural authority. The oracle's pronouncements shaped military strategy, influenced religious practice, and guided the founding of colonies. Archaeological evidence shows that the oracle's sanctuary was one of the wealthiest institutions in the ancient world, filled with treasures donated by grateful clients whose prophecies had proven fortuitous. Whether the Pythia genuinely perceived the future or simply offered wise counsel dressed in mystical language, her influence was undeniable. In ancient China, a different prophetic tradition developed around the Ardars Qing, or Book of Changes. Dating to around the 10th century BCE, the I Ching offered guidance through a system of hexagrams, 6-line symbols, created by casting yarrow stalks or coins. Each hexagram represented a particular situation and its potential transformation. Rather than predicting specific events, the I Ching offered philosophical guidance about how to navigate uncertainty. A person would pose a question, create a hexagram through the casting process, and then read the associated text. The beauty of the system lay in its flexibility. The same hexagram could apply to countless situations, and the reader could find personal meaning in the symbolic language. This approach to prophecy emphasized not knowing the future, but understanding one's relationship to change itself. Medieval Europe transformed prophecy by intertwining it with religious authority. The Christian Church, inheriting both Greek philosophical traditions and Jewish prophetic practices, developed its own framework for understanding divine communication. Monks recorded visions, and the Church carefully vetted claims of divine revelation. Some visions were recognized as genuine spiritual experiences, while others were dismissed as demonic deception or mental illness. The line between prophecy and heresy was thin and dangerous. A prophecy that contradicted church doctrine could result in execution. Yet the Church also recognized that prophecy, properly controlled, could serve institutional interests. Saints' visions were recorded and preserved. Apocalyptic prophecies about the end times circulated widely, creating both anxiety and spiritual fervor. By the Renaissance, prophecy had evolved into something more complex. It was no longer purely spiritual or purely practical, but had become an intellectual pursuit. Scholars blended astrology, numerology, classical learning, and spiritual insight into elaborate systems. The boundaries between what we would now call science and what we would call mysticism were far more permeable than they are today. A Renaissance scholar might study mathematics and astronomy in the morning and consult astrological charts in the afternoon, seeing no contradiction between these pursuits. This was the cultural moment that produced figures like Nostradamus individuals who emerged from genuine learning and applied it to the question that had haunted humanity since the beginning: what will happen next? What united all these diverse traditions? Mesopotamian, haruspicy, Greek oracles, Chinese divination, medieval visions, Renaissance astrology was a fundamental belief the future could be known, and certain individuals possessed the ability to perceive it. Whether through divine inspiration, careful observation of natural patterns, or access to hidden knowledge, some people seemed to see what others could not. This belief persisted across cultures and centuries because it addressed a deep human need. We are creatures who desperately want to understand what lies ahead, and we have always been willing to trust those who claim they can see it. The persistence of prophecy across such different cultures suggests something important about human nature. It is not merely a product of ignorance or superstition, though these may play a role. Rather, prophecy emerges from the intersection of three fundamental human capacities: our ability to imagine the future, our need to reduce uncertainty, and our tendency to find patterns in experience. These capacities are not flaws but features of human consciousness. They have helped us survive, plan, and create meaning in an uncertain world. Understanding this historical context helps us recognize that modern fascination with prophecy is not new. It is not a contemporary phenomenon born from internet culture or the anxieties of the 21st century. Instead, it is a continuation of humanity's oldest quest for certainty in an uncertain world. The methods may change from animal entrails to tarot cards to online psychics, but the underlying impulse remains constant. We still want to know what will happen. We still seek those who claim to see beyond the present moment. And we still find comfort in the belief that the future, though unknown, is somehow knowable. As we move forward to examine specific prophets and their predictions, we carry with us this historical understanding. The prophets we will encounter, Nostradamus, Baba Vanga, Edgar Cayce, and others, did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from a cultural tradition, thousands of years old, a tradition that has shaped how humans think about time knowledge and the possibility of foresight. Their claims and their followers' beliefs must be understood within this larger context of human meaning-making and our eternal conversation with the future. Nostradamus, the man behind the Quatrains. Having traced prophecy back through the centuries, we now encounter one of history's most famous and misunderstood figures. Michel de Nostradam, known to the world as Nostradamus, represents a pivotal moment when prophecy transformed from a spiritual practice into literary mystery. But who was he really, and how did a 16th century physician become the source of endless reinterpretation and speculation? The man we know as Nostradamus was born Michel de Nostradam on December 14, 1503, in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, a small town in southern France. He came from a Jewish family that had converted to Catholicism, a conversion likely undertaken for practical reasons during a time when religious minorities faced significant pressure and danger. His grandfather, Jean de Saint-Rémy, was a respected physician, and his father, Jacques de Nostradam, was a notary and grain merchant. The family's conversion and relative prosperity placed them in a precarious but stable position in French society. Young Michel grew up in a household that valued learning and intellectual pursuits, and he inherited both the family's scholarly inclinations and their careful navigation of religious and social boundaries. In his early adulthood, Nostradamus pursued formal education in medicine. He studied at the University of Montpellier, one of Europe's most prestigious medical schools, where he would have encountered both traditional Galenic medicine and emerging ideas about disease and treatment. The university was a place of intellectual ferment, where ancient texts were being challenged and new observations were being recorded. Nostradamus completed his studies and began practicing medicine initially in Agen and later in other French towns. His medical career would prove formative in ways that extended far beyond the treatment of patients. During the 1540s, Nostradamus lived through one of the most devastating experiences of his era, repeated outbreaks of plague. The plague was not a single event, but a recurring catastrophe that swept through Europe in waves, killing indiscriminately and overwhelming the medical knowledge of the time. Most physicians of the period relied on the theory of miasma, the belief that disease spread through bad air, and prescribed treatments that ranged from ineffective to actively harmful. Bloodletting, the application of leeches, and the burning of aromatic substances were standard practice. Nostradamus, however, adopted approaches that were remarkably progressive for his time. He emphasized cleanliness, fresh air, and clean water. He advised patients to avoid the sick and to maintain good nutrition. He created a rose pill made from rose petals, iris and cypress, that he believed helped prevent infection. While we now understand that these treatments worked not because of the reasons Nostradamus believed, but because they reduced exposure to contaminated materials and improved general health, his methods were notably more effective than those of his contemporaries. Patients survived his care at higher rates than they did under conventional medical treatment. This reputation for medical skill and innovation would follow Nostradamus throughout his life. It established him as a man of learning and practical wisdom qualities that would later lend credibility to his prophetic claims. Around 1550, at the age of approximately 47, Nostradamus began a new phase of his career. He started publishing almanacs, annual publications containing calendars, astrological information, and short prophetic verses. These almanacs were popular publications in Renaissance Europe, and many people contributed to them. What distinguished Nostradamus's contributions was their deliberate obscurity and the growing reputation that surrounded them. In 1555, Nostradamus published the first edition of what would become his most famous work, Les Prophéties, or the Prophecies. This collection consisted of 942 four-line poems, each called a quatrain. The verses were written in a deliberately obscure mixture of French, Latin, Italian, and Greek, with occasional words from other languages. The obscurity was not accidental. Nostradamus himself explained that he wrote in this cryptic manner for several reasons. First, he believed that prophecy should be veiled in mystery, that direct, clear predictions would violate some sacred principle of foresight. Second, and perhaps more practically, the Inquisition was active during this period, and clear predictions about the future, particularly those concerning the church or political rulers, could be interpreted as heresy or sedition. By writing in obscure language, Nostradamus protected himself from accusation while maintaining plausible deniability. He could always claim that his verses were being misinterpreted if they caused offense. The quatrains contain no dates, no specific names, and no verifiable details that would constitute genuine prediction. Instead, they offer vague imagery and symbolic language. Consider one frequently cited quatrain: "The young lion will overcome the older one on the field enclosed in a cage of gold. In 2 wounds made 1, he will die a cruel death." Interpreters have connected this to the death of King Henry II of France in 1559, who was struck in the eye by a lance splinter during a jousting accident. The connection seems compelling when you read the quatrain after the event, but the language is vague enough to apply to countless scenarios involving combat injury and death. Without the historical event to guide interpretation, The quatrain could mean almost anything. This brings us to one of the most significant moments in Nostradamus' life, his rise to prominence at the French court. In 1556, Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, invited Nostradamus to court. Catherine was a powerful and intelligent woman who wielded considerable influence over French politics. She was also deeply interested in astrology and the occult, as were many educated people of her time. The invitation to court transformed Nostradamus from a provincial physician and almanac writer into a figure of national importance. He was received with honor, consulted on matters of state, and granted a pension by the king. His reputation grew exponentially, and his prophecies began to be discussed and debated throughout Europe. The prediction that most solidified Nostradamus' fame was the one concerning King Henry II. After the king's death in the jousting accident, the quatrain about the young lion and the old lion was widely circulated and interpreted as a successful prediction. This interpretation was enormously beneficial to Nostradamus' reputation. However, historians who have examined the evidence carefully note something important: the prediction was vague enough that it could have been applied to many scenarios, and it was only after the event that it was specifically connected to Henry II's death. Moreover, jousting accidents were not uncommon among European nobility, and predictions about death in combat were statistically likely to come true eventually. The specificity that seems so compelling in retrospect was actually added by interpreters after the fact. Despite the ambiguity of his predictions, Nostradamus' fame continued to grow. He became wealthy, was granted noble status, and lived comfortably in Salon de Provence, where he spent his final years. He continued to publish new editions of his prophecies, expanding the collection and revising some verses. He also wrote other works, including a book on cosmetics and a history of Provence. He maintained correspondence with learned people across Europe and was consulted by nobles and scholars. By all accounts, he lived well and died respected, at least among those who believed in his prophetic abilities. Nostradamus died on July 2, 1566, at the age of 62. He left behind a legacy that would prove far more enduring than his medical practice or his other writings. The quatrains, with their deliberate ambiguity and mysterious language, would be reinterpreted for centuries. Each generation would find in them predictions relevant to their own time. The French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon, the world wars, the development of nuclear weapons, all would be claimed as subjects of Nostradamus' prophecies. The more time passed, the more predictions seemed to accumulate. New quatrains would be attributed to him. Interpretations would become more elaborate, and the legend would grow far beyond what the historical Nostradamus could have imagined or intended. The gap between the historical Nostradamus and the legendary prophet is vast and revealing. The historical Nostradamus was a learned man of his time, a physician, an astrologer, an almanac writer, and a court figure. He was intelligent and observant, and he understood how to navigate the political and religious complexities of 16th century France. He wrote deliberately obscure verses that could be interpreted in multiple ways, and he benefited from the ambiguity. The legendary Nostradamus, by contrast, is a figure of almost supernatural foresight, a man who somehow perceived events centuries in the future with remarkable accuracy. This transformation reveals something profound about how humans engage with prophecy. We have a powerful tendency to project our desires for foresight onto ambiguous texts, finding meaning in mystery. When we encounter vague language and symbolic imagery, our pattern recognition systems activate. We search for connections between the text and events in our world. When we find a connection, even a tenuous one, we experience a sense of discovery and confirmation. The ambiguity itself becomes a feature rather than a flaw because it allows us to find whatever meaning we seek. The story of Nostradamus also raises important questions about how predictions are preserved and transmitted. The quatrains were written in the 16th century, but most people today encounter them through modern interpretations, translations, and compilations. Each layer of translation and interpretation introduces the possibility of alteration and reframing. Words are chosen or changed. Emphasis is added or removed, and context is provided or withheld. By the time a quatrain reaches a modern reader or viewer, it may be quite different from what Nostradamus originally wrote. This process of transmission and reinterpretation is not unique to Nostradamus, but it is particularly important for understanding how his legacy has evolved. As we continue our exploration of prophecy, the figure of Nostradamus serves as a crucial case study. He demonstrates both the appeal of prophecy and the mechanisms by which prophecy claims are sustained and amplified. His story invites us to consider how we evaluate claims about foresight, how we interpret ambiguous information, and how legends develop around historical figures. In the next chapter, we will examine more closely how Nostradamus's quatrains have been decoded and reinterpreted across the centuries, exploring the methods used to connect his verses to historical events and the scholarly debates about whether these connections represent genuine insight or constructed meaning. Decoding Nostradamus, how quatrains have been interpreted. The quatrains that Nostradamus left behind are remarkable not for what they clearly say, but for what they seem to suggest. In the centuries since their publication, these 942 four-line verses have been decoded, reinterpreted, and reapplied to nearly every major historical event. But how exactly does this process work? What methods do interpreters use to connect cryptic 16th century poetry to specific historical moments? And perhaps, more importantly, what does this tell us about how humans search for meaning in ambiguous information? The power of the quatrains lies fundamentally in their deliberate ambiguity. Nostradamus wrote in archaic French, mixed with Latin, Italian, Greek, and occasional words from other languages. The verses contain no dates, no specific names of people or places, and no verifiable details that would allow for objective verification. Instead, they offer vague imagery, symbolic language, and metaphorical descriptions. This ambiguity was intentional. Nostradamus believed that prophecy should be veiled in mystery, and he also understood that obscure language provided protection from the Inquisition. But this same ambiguity created something unexpected, a blank canvas onto which interpreters could project their own meanings. In the 17th century, followers of Nostradamus began the work of matching quatrains to contemporary events. This was not a systematic scholarly endeavor, but rather an informal practice of finding connections between the cryptic verses and the news of the day. When significant events occurred, wars, the deaths of rulers, natural disasters, interpreters would search through the quatrains looking for verses that could be made to fit. The process was flexible and creative. A verse about fire could refer to warfare, revolution, or literal flames. A reference to the eagle could mean France, Rome, or any nation with an eagle in its heraldry. A mention of blood could symbolize violence, sacrifice, or simply the color red. This flexibility meant that almost any quatrain could be connected to almost any event if one was creative enough in interpretation. During the French Revolution, revolutionaries claimed that Nostradamus had predicted their cause. They found quatrains that they interpreted as describing the overthrow of monarchy, the storming of the Bastille, and the execution of the king. The verses were ambiguous enough to support these interpretations, and the fact that Nostradamus had lived centuries earlier only added to the sense that he possessed genuine prophetic insight. The revolutionaries were not being deliberately dishonest. They genuinely believed they were discovering hidden meanings that Nostradamus had encoded in his verses. The quatrains seemed to speak to their moment, to validate their struggle as part of a larger historical pattern. Moving into the 19th century, interpreters connected Nostradamus's verses to Napoleon's rise and fall. one frequently cited quatrain, was interpreted as predicting Napoleon's military campaigns, his exile, and his eventual defeat. Again, the language was vague enough to support these interpretations. References to military conquest, to a figure rising from obscurity to exile and return, all of these could be found in the quatrains if one looked carefully. Each generation of interpreters found in Nostradamus what they were looking for. The quatrains became a kind of historical Rorschach test, revealing not the prophet's intentions, but the preoccupations of the interpreters themselves. The 20th century saw even more elaborate connections. Scholars have identified quatrains that interpreters claimed predicted World War I, World War II, the Kennedy assassination, the moon landing, and numerous other events. One quatrain mentions, "The sky will burn at 45 degrees. Interpreters have connected this to everything from nuclear weapons to climate change to the attacks of September 11, 2001. The flexibility of the language allowed for infinite reinterpretation. What happened next would reveal something crucial about how prophecy claims are sustained and amplified. Scholars who study prophecy and interpretation have identified a specific technique that interpreters use. They call it retrofitting. The process works like this. First, an interpreter selects a quatrain. Second, they identify a historical event that has already occurred. Third, they find ways to make the language of the quatrain match the historical event, often through creative translation, metaphorical interpretation, or selective emphasis. Finally, they declare the prediction a success. The crucial element is that the prediction is made after the event has already happened. This is fundamentally different from genuine prophecy, which requires predicting something before it occurs. Consider a specific example to understand how retrofitting works. One quatrain reads, "The great man will be struck down in the day by a thunderbolt, an evil deed foretold by the bearer of a petition. According to the prediction, another falls at night time, conflict at Reims, London, and pestilence in Tuscany." Interpreters have connected this to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. They point to, "The great man will be struck down," interpreting this as Kennedy's death. They find thunderbolt and interpret it as gunfire. They locate "another falls at nighttime" and connect it to the shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald by Jack Ruby. The quatrain, they argue, predicted Kennedy's assassination and the subsequent events. However, when examined carefully, the language is vague enough to apply to countless scenarios involving the death of important figures. The references to Reims, London, and pestilence in Tuscany do not clearly connect to Kennedy's assassination at all. These geographical references seem to refer to European locations, not America. Yet interpreters either ignore these details or reinterpret them creatively. This is the nature of retrofitting. The interpreter selects which parts of the quatrain to emphasize and which to downplay, creating a narrative that connects the prophecy to the historical event. Linguists and historians who have studied the quatrains carefully point out that they contain no specific names, no precise dates, and no verifiable details that would constitute genuine prophecy. If Nostradamus had truly foreseen the Kennedy assassination, one might expect him to mention America, or Kennedy's name, or the year 1963, or Dallas, Texas. Instead, the quatrain mentions European cities and uses vague language that could apply to many scenarios. This absence of specificity is telling. It suggests that the connections between the quatrains and historical events are constructed after the fact, rather than genuinely predicted beforehand. Yet defenders of Nostradamus argue that this very obscurity was intentional. They maintain that Nostradamus deliberately obscured his predictions to protect them either from the Inquisition or from some other threat. They suggest that the vagueness is a feature, not a flaw, that Nostradamus encoded his predictions in symbolic language that only those with sufficient insight could decode. This argument has an appealing logic to it. It explains why the quatrains are so ambiguous, and why they seem to apply to so many different events. However, this argument also creates a logical problem if the predictions are so obscured that they require extensive interpretation. To understand, how can we ever verify whether they are genuine? Any interpretation can be defended as correct, and any failed prediction can be reinterpreted as successful. The scholarly consensus on Nostradamus remains divided. Some historians and linguists view the quatrains primarily as historical artifacts of Renaissance thinking. They see them as products of 16th century intellectual culture, reflecting the interests and preoccupations of Nostradamus's era. These scholars argue that the apparent accuracy of Nostradamus's predictions is entirely due to retrofitting and the human tendency to find patterns in random data. They point out that Nostradamus made no predictions that came true before the events occurred, and that all the famous predictions were identified only after the historical events had already happened. Other scholars maintain that the quatrains contain genuine prophetic insight waiting for proper interpretation. They argue that Nostradamus possessed some form of genuine foresight, whether through intuition, spiritual insight, or access to hidden knowledge. They suggest that the vagueness of the quatrains reflects the nature of prophecy itself, that the future cannot be perceived with perfect clarity, but only in fragmentary symbolic images. These defenders of Nostradamus continue to search for new interpretations, convinced that deeper understanding of the quatrains will reveal their true prophetic content. Between these two positions lies a more nuanced view. Some scholars suggest that Nostradamus was an intelligent observer of human nature and historical patterns. He understood that certain types of events, wars, the deaths of rulers, natural disasters recur throughout history. By writing about such events in vague terms, he created verses that would inevitably seem to match actual historical occurrences. This is not necessarily conscious deception, but rather a natural consequence of writing about universal human experiences in symbolic language. The quatrains work precisely because they describe things that happen repeatedly in human history. The Nostradamus phenomenon teaches us something important about human cognition and our relationship to prophecy. It demonstrates how powerfully our pattern recognition systems work. The human brain evolved to detect patterns because this ability enhanced survival. However, this same mechanism leads us to see patterns in random data, a phenomenon that psychologists call apophenia. When we encounter ambiguous information, like Nostradamus's quatrains, our brains automatically search for connections to our own experience and knowledge. We find these connections not because they were intentionally placed there, but because our brains are wired to find patterns. This cognitive tendency affects not just how we interpret Nostradamus, but how we evaluate all claims of prophecy. We tend to remember predictions that came true and forget those that failed. We interpret vague predictions, flexibly finding ways to make them fit actual events. We give credit for lucky guesses and dismiss failed predictions as misinterpretations. These biases operate automatically without our conscious awareness. Understanding them helps us approach prophecy claims with appropriate skepticism, while still remaining open to genuine insight. Having explored how Nostradamus's verses have been decoded and reinterpreted across centuries, we now turn to another famous prophet, whose claims can be examined more directly through documented evidence. Baba Vanga, the blind mystic of Bulgaria. We have examined how Nostradamus's cryptic verses became a canvas for centuries of interpretation and reinterpretation. Now we turn to a prophet of a very different kind, one whose predictions were direct and personal rather than obscure and symbolic. Baba Vanga offers us a different puzzle not how to decode ambiguous language, but how to verify claims made in oral tradition, and how legends develop around living people within a single lifetime. Vangelia Pandeva Gushtarova was born on January 31st, 1911 in Strumica, a town in Macedonia, then part of the Ottoman Empire. She grew up in a region of significant cultural and religious complexity, where Orthodox Christianity, Islam, and Judaism coexisted, where multiple empires had left their mark, and where folk traditions of spirituality remained strong. Her family was not wealthy, but they were respectable. Her father worked as a farmer and merchant. By all accounts, young Vangelia was an ordinary child, playful, curious, and unremarkable in any obvious way. Nothing in her early years suggested that she would become one of the most famous mystics of the 20th century. The turning point came on a day in 1923 when Vangelia was 12 years old. She was outside during a violent sandstorm, a sudden fierce wind that swept across the landscape with tremendous force. According to her own account, which has been repeated countless times, she was caught in this storm and was struck by a powerful gust that threw her to the ground. When the storm passed and she was found, she was unconscious. More significantly, she had gone completely blind. The trauma had damaged her eyes irreparably. Medical examination confirmed that her blindness was total and permanent. She would never see again. For a young person, such a loss would be devastating. Blindness in the early 20th century meant severe limitations on education, employment, and independence. Yet according to Baba Vanga's account, something remarkable happened during her period of adjustment to blindness. As she learned to navigate the world without sight, she began experiencing visions. These were not visual in the conventional sense. She could not see with her eyes, but rather internal perceptions, impressions and knowings that seemed to come from beyond her ordinary consciousness. She described perceiving information about people's lives, their past experiences, their current circumstances, and their possible futures. Whether these experiences were genuine spiritual phenomena, products of her unconscious mind, or something else entirely, remains a matter of interpretation. What is clear is that Vangelia came to believe she possessed extraordinary perceptive abilities, and others came to believe it as well. By the 1940s, Vangelia, now known as Baba Vanga, with Baba being a respectful term meaning grandmother or wise woman, had become a figure of local spiritual authority. People in her community began seeking her out, asking for readings and guidance. Unlike Nostradamus, who offered written prophecies for posterity, Baba Vanga offered direct personal consultations. A person would come to her home, sit in her presence, and she would tell them things about their lives. She claimed to see their past lives to diagnose illnesses they suffered from, to perceive their emotional and spiritual conditions, and to predict events that would occur in their futures. Her followers reported that her readings were often remarkably accurate, that she knew things about them that she could not have learned through ordinary means, and that her predictions frequently came to pass. The Cold War era proved transformative for Baba Vanga's reputation. As Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control, and as the Iron Curtain descended across the continent, people in these regions sought spiritual guidance and hope for the future. Baba Vanga's reputation spread throughout Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Romania, and the Soviet Union itself. People traveled from across Eastern Europe to her modest home in Petric, Bulgaria, a small town near the Yugoslav and Greek borders. The journey was often difficult and expensive, but believers made the pilgrimage nonetheless. Her home became a kind of spiritual center, a place where people came seeking answers to questions about their lives and their futures. She worked tirelessly, conducting readings from early morning until late evening meeting with dozens of people each day. What happened next would demonstrate how prophecy claims spread and become amplified across cultures and generations. The Bulgarian government's relationship with Baba Vanga was complex. Initially, the communist authorities were skeptical of her claims, and viewed her activities with suspicion. Spiritual practices and religious authority were viewed as threats to communist ideology. Yet over time, the government's position shifted. Baba Vanga had become so culturally significant, so embedded in the lives of ordinary Bulgarians, that suppressing her would have been politically costly. Eventually, the government came to recognize her cultural importance and even extended her a degree of official recognition. She was allowed to continue her work, and she became a national figure in Bulgaria, known and respected across the country. Baba Vanga died on August 11th, 1996, at the age of 85. By that time, she had conducted readings for tens of thousands of people over several decades. Her followers believed that she had made countless accurate predictions about political leaders and new natural disasters, personal circumstances, and future events. Stories about her abilities circulated widely. People reported that she had predicted the deaths of specific leaders, warned of earthquakes and other natural disasters, and provided guidance that had proven helpful in their lives. Her reputation continued to grow even after her death. In the years following 1996, her legacy has expanded dramatically. Websites, books, documentaries, and social media posts now attribute hundreds of predictions to her. Some of these predictions are documented. Many are not. Some come from people who claim to have received readings from her. Others are second-hand or third-hand accounts passed through multiple people. The challenge in evaluating Baba Vanga's claims lies in the nature of the evidence. Unlike Nostradamus, whose Quatrains were published in written form and have been preserved, Baba Vanga's statements exist primarily in oral tradition. Most of what we know about her predictions comes from the memories of people who received readings from her, or from family members who heard about her readings, or from accounts published long after her death. Documentation of her actual statements is sparse and often contradictory. Different people remember the same reading differently. Accounts that were passed through multiple interpreters and translators across decades may have been altered or embellished. The original context of her statements is often lost. A prediction that was made in response to a specific question, with specific qualifications or nuances, may be recorded in a simplified or generalized form. Consider the challenge this creates for verification. If someone claims that Baba Vanga predicted a specific event, how do we verify this claim? We would need to establish that the prediction was made before the event occurred. We would need to find contemporary documentation of the prediction. We would need to confirm that the prediction was specific enough to constitute genuine foresight rather than a lucky guess. For most of Baba Vanga's alleged predictions, we cannot meet these criteria. The prediction may be documented in a book published after the event, but we have no way of knowing when the prediction was actually made or whether it was modified after the event to fit the outcome. This leads us to a crucial observation about how prophecy claims function in oral traditions. Oral traditions are fluid. Stories change as they are retold. Details are added or removed. Emphasis shifts. What begins as a vague statement can become a specific prediction through the process of retelling. What was originally qualified or uncertain can become presented as definite. A person's memory of an event can be influenced by subsequent events and by the expectations created by the prophecy itself. These are not necessarily deliberate distortions, but rather natural features of how human memory and oral tradition work. The Baba Vanga phenomenon raises important questions about how we evaluate prophecy claims in general. It demonstrates how prophecy functions differently in oral traditions than in written texts. It shows how legends develop around living people and how claims become amplified across cultures and generations. It reveals the challenges of verification when documentation is sparse and memories are the primary source of evidence. Yet it also demonstrates something about human nature, our deep need to believe that someone understands what lies ahead, that the future is knowable, and that guidance is available to us, whether or not Baba Vanga possessed genuine prophetic abilities, her influence on the lives of those who sought her counsel was real. People made decisions based on what she told them. They found comfort in her readings. They believed that she had helped them navigate their lives. In that sense, her impact was genuine, regardless of whether her predictions were accurate. The story of Baba Vanga also reminds us that prophecy is not merely an intellectual phenomenon, but a deeply human one. It emerges from our encounters with people we believe possess special knowledge or insight. It is sustained through personal relationships and community belief. It functions not just as prediction, but as a form of guidance, comfort, and meaning-making. As we continue our exploration of prophecy, we now turn to another figure whose claims can be examined through more extensive documentation, a man whose readings were meticulously recorded and preserved, allowing us to compare his predictions to actual outcomes in ways that are not possible with either Nostradamus or Baba Vanga. Baba Vanga's predictions, separating verified claims from legend. The challenge of evaluating Baba Vanga's prophetic claims is fundamentally different from evaluating Nostradamus's quatrains. With Nostradamus, we have written texts that have been preserved for centuries. With Baba Vanga, we must work primarily with oral tradition, memory and accounts recorded long after her death. This distinction is crucial because it affects how we can verify her predictions and how legends about her abilities have developed and spread. Tracking Baba Vanga's actual predictions is extraordinarily difficult. Most of her statements were not recorded during her lifetime. She did not publish books or written compilations of her prophecies. Instead, she conducted personal readings with individuals, and what we know about these readings comes from the memories of those who received them, or from family members who heard about them, or from accounts published years or decades after her death. Her followers and family members documented her statements after her death, creating a corpus of attributed predictions that has grown substantially since 1996. This posthumous documentation is the primary source we have for understanding her prophetic claims. Some frequently cited predictions attributed to Baba Vanga include warnings about terrorism, environmental catastrophe, and political upheaval. One of the most widely shared predictions claims that she foresaw the attacks of September 11, 2001. According to this account, Baba Vanga described, 2 steel birds will crash into 2 tall brothers. The prediction seems remarkably specific and accurate. 2 airplanes did crash into the twin towers of the World Trade Center. The language of steel birds and tall brothers appears to match the event with striking precision. This prediction has circulated widely on the internet, in documentaries, and in books about Baba Vanga. It has become one of the most famous examples cited by believers in her prophetic abilities. However, when researchers have investigated this prediction carefully, they have found something significant. There is no contemporary documentation of this prediction before 2001. No record exists of Baba Vanga making this statement during her lifetime. The prediction does not appear in any documented accounts from before the attacks. Instead, it appears in compilations and websites published after September 11, 2001. This raises an important question. When did this prediction actually originate? Was it made by Baba Vanga decades before the attacks, as believers claim? Or was it created after the attacks attributed to Baba Vanga, retroactively, to give it authority and credibility? The most likely explanation, based on available evidence, is that the prediction was created or significantly modified after the attacks. This is not necessarily the result of deliberate deception. It may be that someone remembered a vague statement Baba Vanga made about future conflict or disaster, and after 9/11, they reinterpreted that vague statement as a specific prediction about the attacks. The human memory is suggestible and malleable. When we encounter a significant event, our minds can reinterpret earlier memories to fit the new information. A vague prediction about conflict or destruction can be remembered as a specific prediction about a particular event after that event has occurred. Similarly, predictions attributed to Baba Vanga about the Chernobyl disaster in 1986 lack verifiable contemporary records. Believers claim that she predicted a catastrophic nuclear accident in the Soviet Union. Yet no documentation exists of this prediction being made before the disaster. The prediction appears in accounts published after Chernobyl, when people were looking back and trying to find evidence that Baba Vanga had foreseen the event. The same pattern appears with predictions about the Challenger space shuttle disaster in 1986, various political events, and other major occurrences. This pattern predictions appearing in documentation only after the events they supposedly predicted have occurred is a significant red flag. It suggests that the predictions may be examples of retrofitting the same technique we identified with Nostradamus' Quatrains. Someone identifies a historical event, then searches through Baba Vanga's alleged statements, looking for something that could be interpreted as predicting that event. When they find something sufficiently vague, they declare it a successful prediction. The absence of contemporary documentation does not necessarily prove that Baba Vanga made no accurate predictions. It is possible that her predictions were simply not recorded at the time they were made. People who received readings from her may have remembered them accurately and reported them truthfully decades later. However, without contemporary documentation, we cannot verify when the predictions were made or whether they were modified after the events they supposedly predicted. Skeptics argue that vague statements about future conflict, natural disasters, or political change are statistically likely to match some events, especially when interpreted flexibly after the fact. If someone makes hundreds of vague predictions about future wars, earthquakes, political upheaval, and social change, some of those predictions will inevitably match actual events simply by chance. This is the principle of probability. The more predictions made, and the vaguer they are, the more likely some will appear to come true. When we remember only the hits and forget the misses, the illusion of accuracy becomes very strong. Believers in Baba Vanga's abilities counter that her personal readings for individuals were often remarkably accurate. They argue that while her general predictions about world events may be difficult to verify, her specific readings for people who visited her were frequently correct. She would tell people things about their lives that she could not have known through ordinary means. She would diagnose illnesses accurately. She would provide guidance that proved helpful. These personal experiences, believers argue, constitute genuine evidence of her prophetic abilities. However, these personal readings also lack independent verification. We have no way to confirm whether Baba Vanga's statements were actually accurate or whether people's memories of her readings have been influenced by subsequent events and by their expectations. A person might remember that Baba Vanga predicted something that later came true, but this memory could be influenced by confirmation bias, the tendency to remember hits and forget misses. A person might also unconsciously modify their memory of what Baba Vanga said to make it fit what actually happened. These are not deliberate deceptions, but natural features of how human memory works. Bulgarian researchers have attempted to compile Baba Vanga's documented statements, trying to create a more reliable record of her actual predictions. Even these compiled statements show signs of embellishment and reinterpretation. Different sources report the same prediction differently. Accounts vary in their details and emphasis. Some statements are attributed to her in multiple versions, with significant variations. This variation is understandable, given that the statements were passed through multiple people, translated across languages, and recorded years after they were allegedly made. But it also makes it difficult to know what Baba Vanga actually said. The fundamental challenge is this: without contemporaneous, specific, and independently verifiable records distinguishing genuine prophecy from coincidence or retrofitting becomes impossible. We cannot know whether Baba Vanga possessed genuine prophetic abilities or whether her reputation developed through the same mechanisms that create the illusion of prophecy in other cases. The vagueness of her alleged predictions, the absence of contemporary documentation, the pattern of predictions appearing only after events have occurred, and the flexibility with which her statements can be interpreted, all suggest that her reputation may be based more on these mechanisms than on genuine foresight. Yet this conclusion does not fully capture the complexity of Baba Vanga's legacy. Even if her predictions were not accurate in a literal sense, her influence on people's lives was real. People made decisions based on her readings. They found comfort and guidance in her counsel. They experienced her as genuinely helpful and insightful. In that sense, her impact was genuine, regardless of whether her predictions were accurate. The question of whether prophecy works is not purely a matter of accuracy. It also involves the psychological and social functions that prophecy serves in people's lives. The Baba Vanga case demonstrates how prophecy claims become established as cultural truth through repetition and belief, regardless of documentary evidence. A prediction that appears in multiple sources, that is repeated in documentaries and books, that is shared widely on the internet, gradually becomes accepted as fact. The original source of the prediction becomes obscure. The question of whether it was documented before or after the event becomes forgotten. What remains is the belief that Baba Vanga made this prediction, and this belief becomes part of her cultural legacy. Over time, the legend grows larger and more elaborate until the historical Baba Vanga, a woman who conducted personal readings in a small Bulgarian town, becomes transformed into a figure of almost supernatural foresight, a woman who somehow perceived events decades in the future with remarkable accuracy. Understanding this process is important not just for evaluating Baba Vanga, but for evaluating all prophecy claims. It reveals how easily legends develop, how memory can be influenced by expectations, and how the absence of evidence can be overlooked when belief is strong enough. It also reminds us that the human need for prophecy is so powerful that we will accept claims with minimal verification if they seem to meet our psychological needs. As we continue our exploration, we now turn to a prophet whose claims can be examined through more extensive and systematic documentation, a man whose readings were meticulously recorded, allowing for genuine analysis of his accuracy and the patterns in his predictions. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet of America. Having examined prophets whose predictions are difficult to verify, we now turn to a figure whose claims can be examined through extensive documentation. Edgar Cayce presents a unique case in the history of prophecy, a man whose readings were meticulously recorded, preserved, and catalogued, allowing researchers to analyze his accuracy and methods in ways that are simply not possible with other prophets. His story offers us a rare opportunity to test prophecy claims against historical evidence. Edgar Cayce was born on March 18, 1877 in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, into a rural religious household. His family were devout Christians, and religious faith was woven into the fabric of daily life. Young Edgar grew up in an environment where spiritual experiences were taken seriously, where prayer was practiced, and where the possibility of divine communication was accepted as part of the natural order. He was a quiet, thoughtful child, and as he grew into adolescence, he showed an inclination toward spiritual matters. He attended school but was not an exceptional student in the conventional sense. However, he possessed a keen interest in the Bible and in spiritual questions that went beyond what his formal education provided. In his late teens and early 20s, Cayce worked various jobs as a photographer, a salesman, and a clerk. His life seemed to be following an ordinary trajectory. Then in his early 20s, something remarkable occurred. Cayce discovered that he could enter trance states, deep states of unconsciousness or altered consciousness, during which he would speak about people's medical conditions. In these trance states, he would provide detailed diagnoses of illnesses he had never studied, suggest treatments he had never learned, and offer information about people he had never met. Most remarkably, these diagnoses were often accurate. People who received readings from Cayce reported that he identified illnesses they were suffering from, sometimes illnesses that conventional doctors had missed or misdiagnosed. The mechanism of Cayce's abilities remained mysterious. He himself did not fully understand how they worked. When in a trance state, Cayce would have no memory of what he had said. He would lie down, close his eyes, and enter a state of deep sleep or unconsciousness. His wife or an associate would pose questions or provide information about a person seeking a reading. Cayce would then speak, describing the person's condition, their symptoms, and potential treatments. The information would flow from him in a steady stream, often quite detailed and technical. Then, after perhaps an hour or more, he would awaken with no recollection of what he had said. His wife or secretary would have recorded everything, transcribing his words into written form. Cayce's supporters believed that he accessed what they called the Akashic Records, a supposed universal library or database of all knowledge that existed on a spiritual plane. According to this belief, all events, all knowledge, all information about every person and everything that had ever existed was recorded in these Akashic Records. Cayce, in his trance state, supposedly gained access to this universal knowledge and could retrieve information about a person's health, their past lives, their spiritual condition, and their future possibilities. This explanation appealed to many people because it provided a framework for understanding how Cayce could know things he had no ordinary way of knowing. Between 1901 and his death in 1945, Cayce gave approximately 14,000 readings. This extraordinary number of readings created an unprecedented situation. We have extensive contemporary records of his actual statements. His secretary Gladys Davis meticulously documented his readings, transcribing his words into written form. These transcripts were preserved, catalogued, and eventually made available for research. The Association for Research and Enlightenment, founded by Cayce and his supporters, maintained these records and made them accessible to scholars and researchers. This creates a unique opportunity. Unlike Nostradamus's Quatrains, which are subject to interpretation and reinterpretation, or Baba Vanga's predictions, which exist primarily in oral tradition, Cayce's readings are documented in their original form. We can examine exactly what he said when he said it, and whether his statements proved accurate. Medical researchers have examined Cayce's diagnoses, and their findings are nuanced. Some of his diagnoses were remarkably insightful. He identified conditions that conventional doctors of his era had missed. He suggested treatments that, while unconventional, sometimes proved helpful. His emphasis on diet, exercise, and lifestyle factors as important to health was ahead of its time. In the early 20th century, conventional medicine focused primarily on acute illness and pharmaceutical interventions. Cayce's emphasis on preventive health and holistic approaches anticipated modern understanding of health and wellness by decades. However, many of Cayce's diagnoses contained errors or reflected the medical understanding of his era rather than advanced knowledge. He sometimes made diagnoses that were vague or could apply to many conditions. He suggested treatments that were ineffective or based on outdated medical theories. He used medical terminology in ways that were sometimes imprecise or incorrect. When his diagnoses are examined systematically, the pattern that emerges is complex. Some readings were accurate and insightful. Some were partially correct. Some were entirely wrong. The overall accuracy rate was better than chance, but not dramatically so. This pattern is consistent with what we would expect from an intelligent person with some medical knowledge, who was also influenced by the medical understanding of his era and by the power of suggestion. Cayce did make predictions about future events, though this was not his primary focus. Unlike prophets who specialized in predicting the future, Cayce's readings were primarily concerned with people's current conditions and their spiritual development. However, scattered throughout his 14,000 readings are predictions about future events. He warned about geological catastrophes, including major earthquakes that would occur in California and Japan. He predicted wars and social upheaval. He spoke of a spiritual transformation that would occur in humanity's future. He predicted the discovery of the lost continent of Atlantis and the emergence of a new spiritual age. Some of Cayce's predictions did come to pass. Major earthquakes did occur in California and Japan, as he predicted. However, earthquakes in these regions are common and predictable based on geological knowledge. The Pacific Ring of Fire, where these earthquakes occur, is one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. Predicting that earthquakes will occur in California and Japan is not particularly remarkable. It is virtually certain that they will occur eventually. Wars and social upheaval also occurred as Cayce predicted, but again, these are virtually inevitable in human history. Predicting that wars will occur is not a particularly impressive feat of prophecy. Other predictions attributed to Cayce remained unverified. He predicted that Atlantis would be discovered in 1968 or 1969. Despite extensive underwater exploration and archaeological research, no evidence of Atlantis has emerged. He predicted that major earthquakes would sink portions of California into the ocean by 1998. California remains geographically stable. He predicted that a new age of spiritual enlightenment would begin around the year 2000. The year 2000 passed without the predicted transformation. He predicted the emergence of a new continent in the Atlantic Ocean. This prediction also remains unfulfilled. What happened next would reveal something important about how Cayce's legacy has been shaped and interpreted. After Cayce's death in 1945, his followers and supporters continued to promote his work and his predictions. They published books, founded organizations, and worked to preserve his legacy. In doing so, they sometimes emphasized his successful predictions while downplaying or ignoring his failed ones. Predictions that did not come to pass were reinterpreted. A prediction about a specific date might be reframed as a prediction about a spiritual event rather than a physical one. A prediction about a specific location might be generalized to apply to a broader region. Through these processes of reinterpretation and selective emphasis, Cayce's reputation as a prophet was maintained and even enhanced. Cayce's documented record offers a rare opportunity to examine prophecy claims against historical evidence. Because his readings were preserved in their original form, we can compare what he said to what actually happened. We can identify patterns in his accuracy and inaccuracy. We can examine whether his predictions were specific enough to constitute genuine prophecy, or whether they were vague enough to apply to many scenarios. The evidence suggests that Cayce was an intelligent, perceptive person who possessed genuine insights into human psychology and health. However, the evidence does not support the claim that he possessed genuine prophetic abilities or access to universal knowledge. His predictions were either vague enough to apply to many scenarios, specific enough to be falsifiable, and therefore fail, or documented so poorly that verification is impossible. Cayce's case is particularly instructive because it demonstrates how the same mechanisms that create the illusion of prophecy in other cases operated in his life as well. His followers remembered his hits and forgot his misses. They reinterpreted failed predictions as successes. They attributed knowledge to him that could have been obtained through ordinary means. They believed in his abilities so strongly that they unconsciously shaped their memories and interpretations to support that belief. These are not deliberate deceptions, but natural features of how human belief systems work. Understanding these mechanisms helps us approach all prophecy claims with appropriate skepticism. Cayce's legacy differs from other prophets because his readings were preserved systematically, allowing for genuine analysis rather than speculation. Yet this analysis reveals that even with extensive documentation, prophecy claims do not hold up well under scrutiny. The patterns we see in Cayce's readings, vague predictions that seem to fit many scenarios, specific predictions that fail, reinterpretation of failed predictions as successes, are the same patterns we see in other prophecy claims. This consistency across different prophets and different eras suggests that these patterns reflect fundamental features of how human cognition processes prophecy claims rather than evidence of genuine prophetic ability. As we continue our exploration, we now examine what science reveals about the possibility of prophecy itself. Scientific perspectives on prophecy and precognition. Having examined the lives and claims of specific prophets, we now shift our perspective. Rather than asking whether individual prophets were accurate, we ask a more fundamental question: is prophecy even possible? What does modern science reveal about the nature of foresight, prediction, and human perception of future events? Modern science approaches prophecy with a particular stance, skeptical but not dismissive. Scientists recognize that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, yet they remain open to investigating phenomena that might seem implausible. This balanced approach has led researchers in multiple disciplines to examine prophecy and related phenomena through controlled experiments and rigorous methodology. The results of these investigations offer important insights into both the possibilities and limitations of human foresight. Parapsychology is the scientific field most directly concerned with investigating claims of prophecy and precognition. Parapsychologists have conducted controlled experiments testing whether individuals can perceive future events through means other than ordinary sensory perception. These experiments typically involve asking subjects to predict the outcome of random events, the flip of a coin, the shuffle of cards, the generation of random numbers by a computer. If genuine precognition exists, subjects should be able to predict these outcomes at rates significantly better than chance. If precognition does not exist, subjects should predict correctly at rates consistent with random guessing, approximately 50% for binary choices. The most rigorous studies conducted at prestigious universities, including Duke University and Princeton University, have found no consistent evidence of genuine precognition beyond chance levels. Thousands of experimental trials have been conducted over decades. When results are analyzed carefully, the overall accuracy rates are indistinguishable from what would be expected if subjects were simply guessing. Some individual experiments have produced results that appear to show precognitive ability, but when these results are examined more carefully, alternative explanations emerge. The experimental design may have contained flaws. The statistical analysis may have been performed incorrectly, or the positive results may simply reflect random variation, the inevitable fluctuations that occur when dealing with probability. However, some researchers have reported small statistical anomalies in their data. These anomalies are subtle. They represent deviations from chance that are larger than would be expected, but still quite small in absolute terms. Some parapsychologists interpret these anomalies as evidence of weak precognitive effects that exist, but are difficult to detect reliably. The scientific consensus, however, remains skeptical of this interpretation. Most researchers attribute these anomalies to experimental design flaws or publication bias. Publication bias refers to the tendency of researchers to publish studies that show positive results, while studies that show negative results remain unpublished. If hundreds of researchers conduct precognition experiments, and only those who find positive results publish their findings, the published literature will appear to show evidence of precognition, even if the actual phenomenon does not exist. This is a well-documented problem in scientific research across many fields. Cognitive psychology offers compelling explanations for why prophecy seems to work even if genuine precognition does not exist. These explanations reveal the mechanisms by which human cognition naturally generates the illusion of foresight. Understanding these mechanisms is crucial for evaluating prophecy claims. Pattern recognition is one of the most fundamental cognitive abilities. The human brain evolved to detect patterns in the environment because this ability enhanced survival. Our ancestors who could recognize patterns, the pattern of animal tracks, indicating prey, the pattern of weather, changes indicating seasonal shifts, the pattern of social behaviors indicating danger, were more likely to survive and reproduce. This pattern recognition ability is essential and powerful. However, it has a significant drawback. It leads us to see patterns even where none exist. This phenomenon is called apophenia, and it operates automatically and powerfully in human cognition. When we encounter ambiguous information, vague prophecies, random data, unclear situations, our brains automatically search for patterns. We find connections between the information and our own experience. We create narratives that make sense of the ambiguity. This process happens unconsciously. We don't deliberately decide to find patterns. Our brains do it automatically. This is why Nostradamus's Quatrains seem so accurate. Our pattern recognition systems find connections between the vague verses and historical events. This is why Baba Vanga's vague statements seem to predict specific events. Our brains reinterpret the vague statements to fit the events that actually occurred. Confirmation. Bias is another powerful cognitive mechanism that sustains belief in prophecy. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in ways that confirm our existing beliefs. If we believe that a prophet is accurate, we will tend to remember the predictions that came true and forget those that failed. We will interpret ambiguous predictions as successful. We will seek out information that supports our belief and avoid information that contradicts it. This bias operates automatically and powerfully. Even people who consider themselves skeptical and rational are subject to the confirmation bias. It is a fundamental feature of how human cognition processes information. Retroactive fitting is the process by which vague statements are reinterpreted to match subsequent events. This process is particularly powerful when combined with confirmation bias and pattern recognition. A person makes a vague statement about the future. An event occurs. The person's memory of the vague statement is unconsciously modified to match the event more closely. The statement is remembered as more specific and accurate than it actually was. Over time, through repeated retelling and reinterpretation, the vague statement becomes a specific, accurate prediction. This process is not deliberate deception, but rather a natural feature of how human memory and interpretation work. These cognitive mechanisms, pattern recognition, confirmation, bias, and retroactive fitting, operate automatically and powerfully. They make it difficult for even skeptical people to resist seeing prophecy in ambiguous information. A person can be intellectually convinced that prophecy is unlikely and still find themselves experiencing a sense of recognition when they encounter a vague statement that seems to match a subsequent event. The cognitive mechanisms operate below the level of conscious awareness and deliberate reasoning. Understanding this helps us approach prophecy claims with appropriate humility about our own cognitive biases. Neuroscience has revealed that the human brain is fundamentally predictive. The brain does not simply passively receive information from the environment. Instead, it constantly generates predictions about what will happen next. These predictions are based on patterns learned from past experience. The brain compares these predictions to actual sensory input. When predictions match reality, the brain continues with minimal processing. When predictions do not match reality, the brain generates an error signal that triggers more intensive processing. This predictive function is essential for navigating the world. It allows us to anticipate what will happen and prepare appropriate responses. This predictive capacity might feel like prophecy when it occasionally produces accurate intuitions. A person might have a strong sense that something will happen, and then it does. This experience feels like genuine foresight. However, what is actually occurring is that the brain's predictive systems have recognized patterns in the current situation that match patterns from past experience. The brain has generated a prediction based on these patterns. The prediction happens to be accurate. The person experiences this as a mysterious intuition or premonition, but it is actually the brain's predictive systems working as designed. These accurate intuitions are not evidence of genuine prophecy, but rather evidence of the brain's sophisticated pattern recognition and prediction abilities. Research on the default mode network has revealed something interesting about the brain states associated with prophecy and mystical experience. The default mode network is a set of brain regions that are active when the brain is at rest, not focused on external tasks. This network is involved in self-referential thinking, imagination, and associative thought. When people meditate, enter trance states, or engage in contemplative practices, the activity in the default mode network changes in characteristic ways. The brain's normal filtering and editing processes are reduced. Associations between different ideas and memories become more fluid. Imaginative and creative thinking increases. This is the mental state that mystics and prophets often cultivate through meditation, prayer, or trance induction. It is a state in which the normal constraints on thought are relaxed, allowing for more creative and associative thinking. This state of consciousness can produce genuine insights and creative breakthroughs. Artists, scientists, and thinkers across many fields have reported that their best ideas come during periods of relaxed associative thinking. However, this state can also produce false insights and illusory connections. The relaxation of normal filtering processes that allows for genuine creativity also allows for the generation of false patterns and incorrect associations. A person in this state might experience a sense of profound insight or connection that feels absolutely real, but is actually based on illusory patterns. This helps explain why mystical and prophetic experiences feel so compelling and meaningful. The brain state associated with these experiences is one in which the normal constraints on thought are relaxed, allowing for both genuine insight and illusory connection. Scientific investigation doesn't prove prophecy impossible. It is theoretically possible that genuine precognition exists and simply has not been reliably detected in laboratory experiments. It is possible that prophecy operates through mechanisms that science has not yet discovered. However, scientific investigation does reveal that human cognition naturally generates the illusion of foresight through well-understood mechanisms. It reveals that the brain's pattern recognition systems, confirmation, bias, retroactive fitting, and predictive capacities all work together to create compelling experiences of prophecy, even in the absence of genuine foresight. It reveals that altered states of consciousness, while potentially valuable for creativity and insight, can also produce illusory patterns and false connections. Understanding these mechanisms helps us evaluate prophecy claims with greater sophistication, recognizing both the genuine insights that prophets may offer and the cognitive biases that shape how we interpret and remember their predictions. As we continue our exploration, we now examine specific predictions attributed to famous prophets about the 21st century, applying the understanding we have developed to evaluate these claims. Predictions about the 21st century, what the prophets foresaw. Understanding the cognitive mechanisms behind prophecy claims helps us evaluate specific predictions. Now we apply this understanding to examine what famous prophets actually predicted about the 21st century and how these predictions have fared against reality. This examination reveals patterns that illuminate how prophecy claims are sustained even when they fail to materialize. Nostradamus's Quatrains have been extensively reinterpreted to address the modern era. Since the year 2000, interpreters have connected his verses to terrorism, climate change, artificial intelligence pandemics, and numerous other contemporary concerns. The flexibility of the Quatrains makes this reinterpretation possible. Vague language about conflict can be applied to terrorism. References to heat and fire can be connected to climate change. Mentions of plague or disease can be linked to pandemics. One frequently cited quatrain is believed by some interpreters to predict a great plague in the 21st century. These interpreters have connected this prediction to the COVID-19 pandemic, which emerged in late 2019 and spread globally in 2020. However, when examined carefully, the quatrain contains no specific details that would constitute genuine prediction. It mentions no dates, no locations, no specific characteristics of the disease. The language is vague enough to apply to any epidemic or pandemic. Pandemics have occurred repeatedly throughout human history, and predicting that another would occur in the 21st century is not particularly remarkable. The connection between the quatrain and COVID-19 was made after the pandemic had already begun, not before. This pattern of retrofitting is consistent across Nostradamus interpretations for the 21st century. Interpreters identify contemporary events, then search through the quatrains, looking for verses that could be made to fit. When they find something sufficiently vague, they declare it a successful prediction. The process is flexible enough that almost any major event can be connected to some quatrain. Wars, natural disasters, political upheavals, technological developments, all have been claimed as subjects of Nostradamus's prophecies. Yet none of these predictions were identified before the events occurred. All emerged through retrospective interpretation. Baba Vanga reportedly made numerous predictions about the 21st century, though, as we have discussed, documentation of these predictions is sparse and often contradictory. One frequently cited prediction warns of a third world war beginning in 2010, which would involve nuclear weapons and result in massive casualties. This specific prediction did not occur. The year 2010 passed without the predicted global conflict. Yet this failed prediction receives minimal attention. Instead, believers focus on her vague warnings about environmental catastrophe wars and technological transformation predictions so general that they could apply to any era. Another prediction, attributed to Baba Vanga, warns of the emergence of new diseases and climate-related disasters in the 21st century. These predictions are vague enough to apply to virtually any scenario. New diseases do emerge periodically, as demonstrated by COVID-19, Ebola, and other recent outbreaks. Climate-related disasters occur regularly. These are not remarkable predictions, but rather statements about phenomena that are virtually certain to occur. The vagueness makes verification impossible. A believer can point to any disease, outbreak, or climate-related disaster and claim it was predicted by Baba Vanga. A skeptic can point to the vast number of diseases and disasters that did not occur and note that the predictions were too vague to constitute genuine foresight. Edgar Cayce made specific predictions about the 21st century that can be examined against actual outcomes. He predicted major geological upheavals, including the sinking of parts of California into the ocean. He predicted the emergence of new continents in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. He predicted a shift in Earth's axis. He predicted the discovery of advanced ancient civilizations, particularly Atlantis. He predicted that a new age of spiritual enlightenment would begin around the year 2000. These predictions are specific enough to be falsifiable. We can examine whether they came true. The sinking of California has not occurred. California remains geographically stable. Earthquakes occur regularly, as they do in all tectonically active regions, but no catastrophic sinking has taken place. The emergence of new continents has not occurred. No new continents have appeared in the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans. The shift in Earth's axis has not occurred. Earth's axis has remained stable with only minor variations. The discovery of Atlantis has not occurred. Despite extensive underwater exploration and archaeological research, no evidence of Atlantis has been found. The new age of spiritual enlightenment did not begin around 2000. The year 2000 passed without the predicted spiritual transformation. These failed predictions are significant because they demonstrate that Cayce's predictions, when specific enough to be tested, do not hold up to scrutiny. Yet Cayce's reputation as a prophet remains strong among his followers. How is this possible? The answer lies in the mechanisms we have discussed: selective memory, reinterpretation, and the focus on vague predictions that can be made to fit almost any scenario. Believers remember Cayce's hits and forget his misses. They reinterpret failed predictions as referring to spiritual rather than physical events. They focus on his vague warnings about future change while ignoring his specific predictions that did not come to pass. More recent prophets and psychics have made specific predictions about the 21st century that can be examined. In 1997, a popular psychic predicted that a comet would strike Earth on May 15, 2003, causing massive destruction and loss of life. This prediction was specific: a particular date, a particular type of event, a particular outcome. When May 15, 2003 arrived, no comet struck Earth. The prediction failed completely. Yet this failed prediction received minimal attention. It was not widely publicized when it failed. Instead, it was quietly abandoned, and the psychic moved on to make new predictions. Another prediction claimed that a major earthquake would devastate California on a specific date in 2018. This prediction was also specific enough to be falsifiable. The predicted date arrived and no major earthquake occurred. Again, the failed prediction was not widely publicized. It did not damage the psychic's reputation significantly because most people were unaware that the prediction had been made or that it had failed. This pattern of specific predictions failing, while vague predictions are remembered as successful, reveals something important about how prophecy claims are sustained. The predictions that are remembered and celebrated are those that are vague enough to apply to many scenarios, or those that are retrofitted to match events after they occur. The predictions that are specific and falsifiable tend to fail. When they fail, they are forgotten or reinterpreted. When they succeed, they are celebrated. This asymmetry in memory and attention creates the illusion that prophets are more accurate than they actually are. The pattern across all 21st century predictions is consistent. They are either vague enough to apply to any scenario, specific enough to be falsifiable and therefore fail, or documented so poorly that verification is impossible. No prediction has emerged that is both specific enough to constitute genuine foresight and documented well enough to be verified as having been made before the event it supposedly predicted. This consistency across different prophets and different eras suggests that the pattern reflects fundamental features of how prophecy claims function, rather than evidence of genuine prophetic ability. Consider the logical structure of prophecy claims. If a prophecy is vague, it can be made to fit many events, making it seem accurate. If a prophecy is specific, it is likely to fail because the future is inherently unpredictable. If a prophecy is made before an event and documented, it can be verified. But if a prophecy is made before an event and not documented, it cannot be verified. We have no way of knowing what was actually predicted. The only way a prophecy can appear to be both specific and accurate is if it is documented after the event, allowing for retrofitting and reinterpretation. This is precisely what we see in the historical record. Examining actual 21st century predictions reveals that prophecy claims struggle when tested against specific verifiable outcomes. The prophets whose predictions we can verify. Edgar Cayce, with his documented readings, made specific predictions that largely failed. The prophets whose predictions are vague or poorly documented, Nostradamus and Baba Vanga, can be claimed to have predicted almost anything through flexible interpretation. This pattern suggests that genuine prophecy, if it exists, is not reliably demonstrated by the claims we have examined. The appearance of accuracy emerges through cognitive biases and selective attention rather than through genuine foresight. As we continue our exploration, we now examine predictions that appeared to come true, analyzing whether these represent genuine prophecy or whether they can be explained through other mechanisms. Predictions that came true, coincidence or foresight. We have examined predictions that failed and explored the cognitive mechanisms that create the illusion of prophecy. Now we turn to the other side of the equation, predictions that appear to have come true. These apparent successes are often cited as evidence of genuine prophetic ability. Yet examining them carefully reveals a more complex picture, one in which vagueness, retrofitting, and selective interpretation play crucial roles. Several predictions attributed to famous prophets appear to have materialized, creating compelling narratives that circulate widely. Nostradamus is often credited with predicting the Great Fire of London in 1666, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the development of nuclear weapons. These apparent successes have made Nostradamus's reputation as a prophet seem credible to many people. Yet when we examine these claims closely, a pattern emerges. The predictions are vague. The connections are made after the events, and alternative interpretations are possible. Consider the Great Fire of London, which occurred in September 1666 and destroyed much of the medieval city of London. Interpreters point to a Nostradamus quatrain that mentions fire and destruction. The quatrain reads in translation, "The blood of the just will be demanded of London, burnt by fire in the year 66. This seems remarkably specific. London did burn in 1666. Blood was shed. The connection appears compelling. However, examining the quatrain more carefully reveals ambiguities. The date reference could be interpreted as 1566, 1666, 766, or other years, ending in 66. Fire and destruction are common themes in prophecy and in history. Many cities have burned. Many events have involved bloodshed. Without the historical event to guide interpretation, the quatrain could apply to countless scenarios. The specificity that seems so compelling in retrospect was actually added by interpreters after the event. The prediction of Napoleon's rise demonstrates another pattern. Interpreters connect Nostradamus's verses to Napoleon through wordplay and matching initials. They argue that references to Nap or Pow in the quatrains refer to Napoleon. They point to verses about a military leader rising from obscurity to power. Yet these connections rely on creative interpretation and selective emphasis. The same verses could be connected to many other military leaders throughout history. The connection to Napoleon was made after his rise to prominence, not before. Historians examining the original French texts note that the interpretations often involve translation choices that emphasize connections to Napoleon while downplaying alternative meanings. The prediction of nuclear weapons is perhaps the most frequently cited example of Nostradamus's apparent foresight. Interpreters point to a quatrain that mentions light and fire, and interpret this as a prediction of nuclear weapons or atomic bombs. One frequently cited translation reads, "Near the gates and within 2 cities, there will be scourges the like of which was never seen, famine within plague people outthrust by steel, crying to the great God for relief." And interpreters have connected light and fire to nuclear weapons and the general description of destruction to nuclear war. However, the original quatrain does not specifically mention light or fire in the way that modern translations suggest. The connection to nuclear weapons is an interpretation, not a clear prediction. References to destruction and suffering could apply to many types of weapons or disasters. The specificity attributed to the quatrain emerges through translation choices and interpretive emphasis rather than from the original text itself. Baba Vanga is credited with predicting the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, the Challenger space shuttle explosion in 1986, and various political events. These predictions seem remarkably specific and accurate, yet documentation of these predictions before the events is absent. They appear in compilations and websites published after the disasters, raising important questions about when they were actually made and whether they were modified after the events to fit the outcomes. The absence of contemporary documentation is significant. If Baba Vanga made specific predictions about these events, why were they not recorded at the time? Why do they appear only in retrospective accounts? One explanation is that vague statements Baba Vanga made about future disasters were reinterpreted after the Chernobyl and Challenger disasters as specific predictions about these events. A general warning about future catastrophes could be remembered after the fact as a specific prediction about a particular disaster. This is not necessarily deliberate deception, but rather a natural feature of how memory works. When we encounter a significant event, our memories of earlier statements can be unconsciously modified to fit the new information. A vague statement becomes remembered as specific. A general warning becomes remembered as a particular prediction. Edgar Cayce made some predictions that proved accurate, though examining these predictions reveals that accuracy does not necessarily indicate genuine foresight. He warned about earthquakes in California and Japan, regions known to be seismically active based on geological knowledge. Earthquakes in these regions are not rare events, but rather predictable consequences of tectonic plate movement. Predicting that earthquakes will occur in California and Japan is statistically likely to be correct. It is not a remarkable feat of prophecy. He predicted wars and social upheaval conditions that have characterized every era of human history. Wars and social upheaval are virtually certain to occur. Predicting them is not particularly impressive. He suggested that medical science would eventually recognize the importance of diet and lifestyle in health and disease. This prediction has come true as modern medicine increasingly emphasizes preventive health and lifestyle factors. However, this represents common sense rather than extraordinary foresight. The connection between diet, exercise, and health has been understood for centuries. Cayce's suggestion that this would be recognized by medical science was not a remarkable prediction. These examples illustrate a fundamental statistical principle if someone makes hundreds of vague predictions about future events. Some will inevitably match actual occurrences simply by chance. This principle is sometimes called the broken clock principle. Even a stopped clock is correct twice a day. If a clock is stopped at 3,000 hours, it will be correct every time the actual time is 3,000 hours. Similarly, if a prophet makes hundreds of vague predictions, some will inevitably match actual events. The more predictions made, and the vaguer they are, the more likely some will appear to come true. Consider the mathematics of this principle. Suppose a prophet makes 100 predictions about future events. Each prediction is vague enough that it could apply to many scenarios. The probability that any given prediction will match some actual event is reasonably high, perhaps 20 or 30%, depending on how vague the prediction is. If 100 predictions are made and each has a 20% chance of matching an actual event, we would expect approximately 20 predictions to appear to come true simply by chance. If the predictions are even vaguer, the percentage could be higher. A person who makes 100 predictions and has 20 of them appear to come true might seem to have a 20% accuracy rate. Yet this accuracy could emerge entirely from chance and vagueness rather than from genuine foresight. The fundamental problem is that we tend to remember the hits and forget the misses. A prophet makes 100 predictions. 20 appear to come true. These 20 successes are celebrated and remembered. The 80 failures are forgotten. The prophet's reputation is built on the 20 successes. People cite these successes as evidence of genuine prophetic ability. Yet the successes could be entirely explained by chance and the selective attention we give to hits versus misses. This pattern is consistent across different prophets and different eras. Nostradamus' apparent successes emerge through retrofitting and creative interpretation. Baba Vanga's apparent successes appear only in retrospective accounts without contemporary documentation. Edgar Cayce's apparent successes involve vague predictions about inevitable events. In each case, closer examination reveals that the apparent accuracy can be explained through mechanisms other than genuine foresight. The predictions are either vague enough to apply to many scenarios, specific predictions that fail, while vague ones are remembered, or documented so poorly that verification is impossible. The apparent accuracy of some prophecies likely reflects our pattern-seeking nature, and the mathematical inevitability that some vague predictions will match random events. Our brains are wired to find patterns. When we encounter vague prophecies and historical events, we search for connections. We find them. Our pattern recognition systems activate. We experience a sense of discovery and confirmation. Yet this sense of discovery reflects the power of our pattern recognition systems rather than evidence of genuine prophecy. The mathematical principle is simple: make enough vague predictions, and some will inevitably match actual events. Remember the hits and forget the misses, and the prophet's reputation grows. This is not evidence of foresight, but rather evidence of how human cognition and memory work. Understanding this helps us approach all prophecy claims with appropriate skepticism. It helps us recognize that apparent accuracy can emerge through mechanisms other than genuine foresight. It reminds us that the absence of failed predictions in our memory does not mean the prophet was accurate. It suggests that we should look for predictions that are specific enough to constitute genuine foresight, documented before the events they supposedly predict, and verified to have come true. By these standards, the historical record of prophecy is remarkably thin. As we continue our exploration, we now examine why humans remain drawn to prophecy, despite the lack of reliable evidence for its validity. Failed predictions when prophets got it wrong. We have examined predictions that appeared to come true and explored the mechanisms that create the illusion of accuracy. Now we turn our attention to the other side of the ledger: predictions that failed to materialize. These failures are equally instructive, revealing patterns in how prophecy claims are sustained despite clear evidence of inaccuracy. Nostradamus predicted that the world would end in several specific years. He predicted apocalyptic events in 1555, the year his first collection of Quatrains was published. He predicted the world would end in 1606. He predicted another apocalyptic transformation in 1732. Each of these dates passed without the predicted apocalyptic events occurring. The world did not end. No global catastrophe took place. No transformation of the magnitude Nostradamus supposedly predicted materialized. Yet these failed predictions did not damage his reputation as a prophet. How was this possible? The answer lies in how interpreters handled these failures. Rather than acknowledging that the predictions were wrong, interpreters reinterpreted them. They suggested that Nostradamus had been referring to spiritual rather than physical endings. They argued that the predictions were about transformations in consciousness or spiritual awakening rather than literal apocalyptic events. They reframed the failed predictions as referring to events that were less visible or dramatic than initially understood. Through these processes of reinterpretation, the failed predictions were transformed into successful ones. The prediction was not wrong. It was simply misunderstood. This demonstrates how failed predictions are retrofitted rather than acknowledged as errors. Baba Vanga reportedly predicted that World War III would begin in 2010 and would involve nuclear weapons. This was a specific prediction, with a specific date and specific characteristics. The prediction was clear enough to be falsifiable. The year 2010 arrived. No World War III began. No nuclear conflict erupted. The prediction failed completely. Yet Baba Vanga's reputation as a prophet remained intact. Why? The answer is that this specific failed prediction receives minimal attention compared to her vague warnings about future conflict. When people discuss Baba Vanga's predictions, they tend to focus on her general warnings about wars and catastrophes rather than on this specific failed prediction. The failed prediction is not widely known or discussed. It has been largely forgotten in popular discourse about Baba Vanga. The selective attention given to her vague predictions while ignoring her specific failures creates the impression that she was more accurate than she actually was. Edgar Cayce made several specific predictions about the future that can be examined against actual outcomes. He predicted that the lost continent of Atlantis would be discovered in 1968 or 1969. This was a specific prediction with a specific time frame. Cayce believed that evidence of Atlantis would be found possibly in the form of physical structures or artifacts. The years 1968 and 1969 passed. No discovery of Atlantis occurred. Despite extensive underwater exploration and archaeological research conducted in the decades since Cayce's prediction, no credible evidence of Atlantis has emerged. The prediction failed, yet Cayce's followers did not abandon their belief in his abilities. Instead, they suggested that Atlantis might be discovered later, or that the discovery had occurred but had been suppressed or overlooked. The failed prediction was not acknowledged as an error, but rather reinterpreted or postponed. Cayce also predicted that major earthquakes would sink parts of California into the ocean by 1998. This was another specific prediction, with a specific time frame and specific geographical location. The prediction was clear: parts of California would sink into the ocean. The year 1998 arrived. California remained geographically stable. No major portions of the state sank into the ocean. The prediction failed completely. Yet this failed prediction also did not significantly damage Cayce's reputation. It is rarely mentioned in discussions of his abilities. When it is mentioned, believers suggest that the prediction might still come to pass, or that it was referring to spiritual rather than physical sinking, or that the time frame was misunderstood. Cayce predicted that a new age of spiritual enlightenment would begin around the year 2000. This prediction was somewhat vague. It did not specify exactly what form this enlightenment would take or how it would be recognized. Yet it was specific enough to be falsifiable. The year 2000 arrived. The predicted spiritual transformation did not occur. The world did not enter a new age of enlightenment. The year 2000 passed like any other year. The prediction failed. Yet again, this failure did not damage Cayce's reputation significantly. Believers suggested that the transformation might be occurring gradually, or that it would take longer to manifest, or that it was happening on a spiritual level that was not visible to ordinary perception. More recent prophets and psychics have made specific predictions about the 21st century that have failed spectacularly. In 1988, a popular psychic predicted that a comet would strike Earth on May 15, 2003, causing massive destruction and loss of life. This prediction was extremely specific: a particular date, a particular type of event, a particular outcome. The prediction circulated among believers. People discussed it. Some expressed concern about the predicted catastrophe. May 15, 2003 arrived. No comet struck Earth. No catastrophe occurred. The prediction failed completely. Yet when the predicted date passed without incident, the prediction was largely forgotten. It was not widely publicized that the prediction had failed. The psychic who made the prediction did not issue a public retraction or acknowledgement of error. Instead, the failed prediction simply disappeared from public discourse. The psychic moved on to make new predictions, and the failed prediction was forgotten. In 2012, numerous psychics and New Age believers predicted that the end of the Mayan calendar on December 21st, 2012, would trigger global catastrophe. Some predicted that a planet would collide with Earth. Others predicted massive earthquakes, tsunamis, or other natural disasters. Still others predicted spiritual or dimensional shifts. The predictions were specific about the date but varied in their details about what would happen. December 21st, 2012 arrived. The Mayan calendar ended as it was supposed to. It simply marked the end of one cycle and the beginning of another, as the Mayan calendar was designed to do. No global catastrophe occurred. No planet collided with Earth. No massive earthquakes or tsunamis devastated the planet. The predictions failed. Yet when nothing happened, these predictions did not receive significant media attention. They were not widely discussed as failed predictions. Instead, they were quietly abandoned. New predictions were made about future catastrophes, and the failed predictions were forgotten. The pattern across all these failed predictions is clear and consistent. Failed predictions are forgotten, reinterpreted, or attributed to misunderstanding. They do not receive the same attention and emphasis as successful predictions. When a prediction fails, believers may suggest that it was misunderstood, or that the time frame was wrong, or that the prediction was referring to something spiritual or invisible rather than physical. Through these processes of reinterpretation and selective attention, failed predictions are minimized, while successful predictions are celebrated and amplified. This asymmetry in how we treat hits versus misses makes it impossible to fairly evaluate prophecy claims using standard evidence. Consider the logical structure of this asymmetry. If a prediction comes true, it is celebrated as evidence of genuine foresight. If a prediction fails, it is reinterpreted or forgotten. Under these conditions, no amount of failed predictions can disprove a prophet's abilities. Any failed prediction can be reinterpreted as successful through creative interpretation. Any prediction that cannot be reinterpreted can simply be forgotten. The belief system becomes unfalsifiable. No evidence can disprove it because any evidence of failure is reinterpreted or ignored. This unfalsifiability is a significant problem from a scientific perspective. Science requires that claims be falsifiable, that there be some possible evidence that could prove them wrong. If a claim is unfalsifiable, it cannot be tested scientifically. The asymmetrical treatment of prophecy predictions, celebrating hits and ignoring misses, makes prophecy claims unfalsifiable. No matter how many predictions fail, believers can reinterpret them as successes or simply forget them. The belief system is protected from disproof. The selective memory surrounding prophecy, celebrating hits and ignoring misses, reveals something important about why belief in prophecy persists. It persists not primarily because of evidence, but because of psychological and cultural factors. The human mind is drawn to patterns and meaning. We remember things that confirm our beliefs and forget things that contradict them. We reinterpret ambiguous information to support our existing worldview. These cognitive biases are powerful and operate automatically. They make it difficult for even skeptical people to maintain doubt in the face of compelling narratives about prophecy. Additionally, prophecy fulfills important psychological needs. It offers comfort in an uncertain world. It suggests that the future is knowable and that someone understands what lies ahead. It provides meaning and narrative structure to random events. It creates a sense of community among believers. These psychological functions are real and valuable even if the prophecies themselves are not accurate. Understanding this helps us appreciate why belief in prophecy persists despite the lack of reliable evidence for its validity. The belief is sustained not by evidence, but by the psychological and social functions it serves. As we continue our exploration, we now examine more deeply why humans are drawn to prophecy and what this reveals about human nature and our relationship to the future. Why we believe in prophecy, the psychology of prediction. Having examined the evidence for and against prophecy, we now ask a different question. Why do humans remain drawn to prophecy, despite the lack of reliable evidence for its validity? The answer lies not in the accuracy of prophecies, but in the psychological, cultural, and existential needs that prophecy fulfills. Understanding these needs helps us appreciate why belief in prophecy persists across cultures and centuries, regardless of empirical evidence. Prophecy appeals to fundamental human needs that are rooted in our nature as conscious beings aware of our own mortality and the passage of time. The first and perhaps most powerful of these needs is the need for control. Humans live in an uncertain world. We cannot predict with certainty what will happen tomorrow, next year, or in our lifetimes. This uncertainty creates anxiety. We worry about the future. We fear the unknown. In an uncertain world, knowing the future or believing that someone can know it reduces anxiety significantly. If someone can tell us what will happen, we can prepare. We can make plans. We can feel less helpless in the face of an unpredictable future. This explains why prophecy flourishes during times of social upheaval, war, or crisis. When the world feels particularly uncertain and threatening, people seek out prophets and predictions with greater intensity. During the Black Death in medieval Europe, when millions died from plague and society seemed on the verge of collapse, prophecy became widespread. People sought out seers and prophets, hoping to understand what was happening and what would come next. During the Cold War, when nuclear weapons created an unprecedented threat to human civilization, interest in prophets like Baba Vanga intensified. People wanted to know whether nuclear war would occur, whether humanity would survive. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when a novel disease spread globally and created widespread fear and uncertainty, prophecy claims proliferated online. People searched for predictions about when the pandemic would end, whether vaccines would work, what the future would hold. In each case, the surge in interest in prophecy corresponded to periods of heightened uncertainty and anxiety. The prophecies offered comfort not because they were accurate, but because they offered the illusion of understanding and control in an uncertain situation. The second psychological appeal of prophecy is that it provides narrative coherence. Humans are storytelling creatures. We naturally seek patterns and meaning in our experience. We organize events into narratives with beginnings, middles, and ends. We look for causes and effects. We want to understand why things happen. Prophecy transforms random events into a meaningful narrative arc. Instead of viewing history as a series of random occurrences, prophecy suggests that history unfolds according to a comprehensible plan. Events are not random, but meaningful. They are part of a larger pattern or destiny. This narrative coherence is psychologically comforting, even if it is intellectually unsatisfying. A world in which events follow a meaningful pattern feels safer and more understandable than a world in which events are random and meaningless. Prophecy provides this sense of meaningful pattern. The third psychological appeal of prophecy is that it offers a sense of special knowledge. Believing in prophecy positions the believer as someone who understands hidden truth that others miss. This creates a sense of intellectual superiority. The believer knows something that skeptics do not. The believer has access to information about the future that ordinary people lack. This sense of special knowledge creates community among believers. People who believe in the same prophet or the same predictions form groups. They share their interpretations. They reinforce each other's beliefs. They feel part of a community of people who understand something important that the wider world does not recognize. This sense of community and special knowledge is psychologically rewarding. The fourth psychological appeal of prophecy is that it addresses the human fear of irrelevance. We all fear that our lives might not matter, that we might be insignificant in the grand scheme of things. If the future is predetermined and knowable, then understanding it makes one significant. A person who understands what will happen is important. They have knowledge that others lack. They can help others prepare for the future. They matter. This psychological appeal explains why prophecy attracts both seekers, people looking for guidance and reassurance, and those who claim prophetic abilities. For seekers, believing in a prophet makes them feel less alone and more prepared for the future. For those who claim prophetic abilities, the role of prophet gives them significance and importance. They matter because they can see what others cannot. The fifth psychological appeal of prophecy is that it satisfies our pattern recognition instinct. The human brain evolved to detect patterns because this ability enhanced survival. Our ancestors who could recognize patterns, the pattern of animal tracks indicating prey, the pattern of weather changes, indicating seasons, the pattern of social behaviors, indicating danger, were more likely to survive and reproduce. This pattern recognition ability is essential and powerful. However, it has a significant drawback. It leads us to see patterns even where none exist. This phenomenon is called apophenia. Prophecy exploits this cognitive tendency perfectly. Prophecies provide ambiguous information, vague language, symbolic imagery, cryptic statements. Our pattern recognition systems automatically activate when we encounter this ambiguous information. We search for connections between the prophecy and events in our world. We find these connections. Our brains interpret the ambiguous information as meaningful. We experience a sense of discovery and confirmation. Yet this sense of discovery reflects the power of our pattern recognition systems rather than evidence of genuine prophecy. These 5 psychological appeals work together to create powerful motivation for belief in prophecy. A person seeking prophecy is motivated by the need for control, the desire for narrative coherence, the appeal of special knowledge, the need to feel significant, and the satisfaction of pattern recognition. When a person encounters a prophecy, these psychological systems activate. The prophecy seems meaningful. It seems to offer insight into the future. It seems to confirm what the person suspected or feared. The person believes. The belief is sustained by selective attention to hits and forgetting of misses, by reinterpretation of failed predictions, and by the community of other believers who reinforce the belief. Understanding these psychological mechanisms does not require us to dismiss prophecy as entirely without value. People who receive readings from prophets often report that the experience was helpful. They felt heard and understood. They gained perspective on their situations. They felt comforted. These psychological benefits are real even if the prophecies themselves are not accurate. A person might receive a reading that is vague enough to apply to many situations, yet the reading might help them think about their life in new ways. They might feel less alone. They might feel that someone understands them. These are genuine psychological benefits. However, understanding the psychological appeal of prophecy also helps us maintain appropriate skepticism about prophecy claims. We can appreciate the psychological value of prophecy while remaining skeptical about its accuracy. We can recognize that the sense of meaning and understanding that prophecy provides emerges partly from our own pattern recognition and systems and psychological needs rather than from genuine foresight. We can believe that prophecy can be psychologically helpful while maintaining that the evidence for genuine prophetic ability is weak. Understanding the psychological appeal of prophecy doesn't diminish its cultural significance, but helps explain why belief persists despite limited empirical evidence. Prophecy persists because it fulfills deep human needs. It offers comfort in an uncertain world. It provides meaning and narrative structure. It creates community and a sense of special knowledge. It satisfies our pattern recognition's instincts. These psychological functions are powerful and operate at levels below conscious awareness. They make belief in prophecy compelling and persistent, regardless of whether the prophecies are actually accurate. This understanding also helps us recognize similar patterns in other belief systems. The same psychological mechanisms that sustain belief in prophecy also sustain belief in conspiracy theories, in pseudoscientific health claims, and political ideologies. In each case, the belief fulfills psychological needs. The belief provides a sense of understanding and control. The belief creates community. The belief satisfies our pattern recognition systems. Understanding these mechanisms helps us approach all such beliefs with appropriate skepticism, while remaining compassionate toward the human needs that these beliefs fulfill. As we continue our exploration, we now turn to how prophecy has evolved in the digital age, examining how internet technology has transformed how prophecy claims spread and are evaluated in contemporary society. Prophecy in the digital age, modern prophets and online prediction. Understanding the psychological appeal of prophecy helps us recognize how these patterns have intensified in the digital era. The internet has fundamentally transformed prophecy from a localized phenomenon into a global instantaneous one. This transformation has created both unprecedented amplification of prophecy claims and unprecedented opportunities for scrutiny and verification. The internet has repackaged historical prophets for digital audiences in ways that often simplify and amplify their claims. Nostradamus and Baba Vanga, who lived centuries or decades ago, have become digital celebrities. YouTube videos with titles like Nostradamus's Most Accurate Predictions or Baba Vanga Predicted Everything circulate widely. Social media posts share compilations of prophecies. TikTok videos present prophecy claims in short, punchy formats designed for maximum engagement. These digital retellings often remove nuance and create false certainty. A quatrain that Nostradamus wrote in deliberately obscure language becomes presented as a clear prediction. A vague statement attributed to Baba Vanga becomes presented as a specific prophecy. The ambiguity that allowed for flexible interpretation in the original texts is stripped away in digital retellings, replaced with definitive claims about what the prophets predicted. This process of simplification and amplification reflects the nature of digital communication. Digital platforms reward content that is sensational, clear, and emotionally engaging. Nuance and complexity are less likely to be shared widely. A video that presents Nostradamus as having made specific, accurate predictions is more likely to be watched and shared than a video that carefully examines the ambiguity of his quatrains and the role of retrofitting in creating the appearance of accuracy. The incentive structure of digital platforms pushes towards sensationalism and away from careful analysis. New prophetic figures have emerged online, building followings through social media platforms. Some of these figures claim to channel spiritual beings or entities. Others present themselves as scientifically informed predictors of future events, claiming to use data analysis or other methods to forecast what will happen. These modern prophets have access to audiences that historical prophets could never have reached. A person can build a following of millions through social media without needing to publish books or travel to meet people in person. The barrier to entry for becoming a prophet has been dramatically lowered. Anyone with a social media account can claim prophetic abilities and potentially build an audience. The digital environment creates powerful incentives to make bold, specific predictions. Vague predictions do not generate engagement. A prediction that something significant will happen in the future will not attract attention. A prediction that a major earthquake will strike California on a specific date is much more likely to be shared and discussed. The more specific and dramatic the prediction, the more likely it is to generate engagement. This creates a perverse incentive structure. Prophets are rewarded for making specific predictions, even though specific predictions are more likely to fail. When a specific prediction fails, it simply disappears into the vast expanse of the internet, replaced by new predictions. The failed prediction is forgotten by most people. The prophet moves on to make new predictions. The speed of digital communication has also accelerated the process of retrofitting. In the pre-digital era, retrofitting occurred slowly. A historical event would occur. Over time, people would search through prophecies looking for connections. Gradually, a narrative would develop, connecting the prophecy to the event. This process took weeks, months, or even years. In the digital age, retrofitting happens within hours. Within hours of a significant event, online communities identify relevant prophecies and create connections. Memes are created, videos are made, posts are shared. This happens so quickly that the original prediction and the retrofitting become conflated in collective memory. People encounter the retrofitted version first. They may never learn that the prediction was made after the event. The original prediction and the retrofitting become merged into a single narrative in which the prophet made a specific, accurate prediction. Digital algorithms have created echo chambers where prophecy believers encounter only confirming information. If a person searches for information about Nostradamus predictions, the algorithm will recommend videos and articles supporting those predictions. The algorithm learns that the person is interested in prophecy and feeds them more prophecy content. Over time, the person's information environment becomes dominated by prophecy claims. They encounter few skeptical analyses. They see primarily content that supports belief in prophecy. This creates a distorted perception of how much evidence supports prophecy claims. A person might believe that prophecy is widely accepted by experts because they encounter primarily content from believers. They may not realize that mainstream scholars and scientists are skeptical of prophecy claims because they rarely encounter such skeptical content in their algorithmically curated information environment. However, the internet has also enabled unprecedented scrutiny of prophecy claims. Researchers can now track when predictions were made. Digital archives preserve content. A person can search for when a prediction was first made and compare it to when the event occurred. If a prediction appears only after an event, this can be documented. Researchers can identify patterns of retrofitting. They can examine how predictions have been modified over time. They can compare different versions of the same prophecy and identify changes. Digital tools make it possible to fact-check prophecy claims in ways that were not possible before. A researcher can search for contemporary documentation of a prediction. If no contemporary documentation exists, this absence can be noted and discussed. This creates tension in the digital age. While the internet amplifies prophecy claims, making them more visible and more persuasive to many people, it also makes verification and debunking more possible than ever before. A person can encounter a prophecy claim on social media and within minutes search for information about when the prediction was made and whether it came true. They can find skeptical analyses. They can learn about the mechanisms of retrofitting. They can discover that the prediction was made after the event. The information is available. However, whether people seek out this information depends on their motivation and their information environment. Someone who is strongly motivated to believe in prophecy may not search for skeptical information. Someone whose algorithmic environment is dominated by prophecy content may not encounter skeptical analyses, even if they search for them. The digital age has also created new forms of prophecy that are specific to the internet. Online communities make collective predictions about future events. These predictions are documented in real time. When the predictions fail, the documentation remains. This creates an unprecedented opportunity to study how prophecy claims develop and are sustained in real time. Researchers can observe how failed predictions are reinterpreted or forgotten. They can see how new predictions emerge to replace failed ones. They can document the mechanisms of retrofitting as they happen. This real-time documentation of prophecy, claims and their failures provides valuable evidence about how prophecy functions in human cognition and culture. The phenomenon of viral predictions illustrates how digital technology has transformed prophecy. A prediction will circulate on social media. It will be shared millions of times. People will discuss it. Memes will be created. The prediction becomes part of popular culture. Then when the predicted event fails to occur, the prediction simply fades away. It is replaced by new predictions. The failed prediction is forgotten by most people. A few researchers might document it, but the general public moves on. This cycle of viral predictions followed by forgotten failures happens continuously in the digital age. The digital age has also seen the emergence of prediction markets and betting sites where people can wager on future events. These sites create financial incentives for accurate predictions. If someone makes a prediction and bets money on it, they have a direct financial incentive to be accurate. However, these sites also reveal something interesting. Even with financial incentives for accuracy, predictions about distant future events are difficult to make. The betting odds on long-term predictions reflect genuine uncertainty about the future. This suggests that the difficulty in making accurate prophecies is not simply a matter of motivation or effort. There may be fundamental limits to how predictable the future is. The digital age has simultaneously amplified prophecy's cultural influence and made its claims more transparent to critical examination. This creates a new landscape for how humans engage with prediction. On one hand, prophecy claims are more visible and more persuasive than ever. They reach larger audiences. They spread faster. They are presented in formats designed to maximize emotional engagement. On the other hand, the tools for verifying and debunking these claims are more powerful than ever. Information about when predictions were made, whether they came true, and how they have been reinterpreted is more accessible than ever. The question is not whether this information is available, but whether people will seek it out, and whether they will be persuaded by it. This tension between amplification and scrutiny will likely continue to characterize prophecy in the digital age. As digital technology continues to evolve, new platforms and formats will emerge for sharing prophecy claims. New prophetic figures will arise. New predictions will circulate. Yet the tools for examining these claims will also continue to evolve. Researchers will develop new methods for tracking predictions and verifying outcomes. The digital record will preserve both the predictions and the evidence of their accuracy or failure. The future of prophecy in the digital age will be shaped by this ongoing tension between those who promote prophecy claims and those who scrutinize them. As we approach the conclusion of our exploration, we now examine the broader implications of what we have learned about prophecy and what it reveals about human nature and our relationship to the future. The science of uncertainty, why the future remains unknowable. Having examined how prophecy functions in human psychology and culture, we now turn to a more fundamental question: is the future even knowable? At the heart of why prophecy cannot work lies not a limitation of human perception, but a fundamental feature of reality itself. Modern science reveals that the future is inherently uncertain in ways that go beyond mere practical difficulty. The unknowability of the future is built into the structure of reality. At the quantum level, reality operates according to principles that seem almost designed to prevent perfect prediction. The uncertainty principle formulated by Physicist Werner Heisenberg, in 1927, states that certain pairs of physical properties cannot be simultaneously known with perfect precision. For example, the more precisely we know the position of a particle, the less precisely we can know its momentum. The more precisely we know its momentum, the less precisely we can know its position. This is not a limitation of our measuring instruments or our knowledge. It is a fundamental feature of reality. Even in principle, even with perfect instruments and perfect knowledge, we cannot simultaneously know both position and momentum with arbitrary precision. This quantum uncertainty might seem like a problem only at the subatomic scale. However, when quantum uncertainty propagates upward through complex systems, it creates unpredictability at macroscopic scales. A tiny quantum fluctuation at one moment can, through a chain of cause and effect, lead to large differences at later times. This is particularly true in chaotic systems that are sensitive to initial conditions. In such systems, even infinitesimal differences in starting conditions can lead to dramatically different outcomes. Chaos theory demonstrates that even deterministic systems, those governed by fixed mathematical rules with no randomness, can produce unpredictable outcomes if they are sensitive to initial conditions. The classic example is weather prediction. The atmosphere is governed by deterministic physical laws. The equations that describe how air moves, how temperature changes, and how pressure varies are well understood. In principle, if we knew the exact state of the atmosphere at one moment, we could calculate what it would be at any future time. Yet in practice, we cannot predict weather more than about 2 weeks in advance. Why not? Because we lack information, or because the laws of physics are unknown, but because the atmosphere is chaotic. Tiny variations in current conditions, a butterfly flapping its wings, in Brazil a slight variation in temperature in one location, compound over time into large differences in weather patterns. This is sometimes called the butterfly effect, the idea that small causes can have large effects. A butterfly flapping its wings in one part of the world can theoretically set off a chain of events that leads to a hurricane in another part of the world. This is not mystical or magical. It is a mathematical consequence of how chaotic systems work. The atmosphere is so sensitive to initial conditions that we can never measure the current state precisely enough to predict weather far into the future. The uncertainty in our measurements, no matter how small, grows exponentially over time. Human behavior adds another layer of unpredictability to the future. Unlike purely physical systems, human decisions involve consciousness, free will, and the capacity to change course based on new information. A person makes decisions based on their beliefs, their values, their current circumstances, and their expectations about the future. If someone predicts that a person will make a particular choice, and that person learns of the prediction, they may deliberately choose differently. This creates a logical paradox, a prediction that becomes known cannot be verified because the knowledge of the prediction changes the outcome. This is sometimes called the self-negating prophecy problem. If a prophet predicts that a person will do X, and the person learns of this prediction, and deliberately does not X, then the prediction has changed the very outcome it was supposed to predict. This problem is not unique to prophecy. It is a fundamental issue in any attempt to predict human behavior when the prediction becomes known to the person whose behavior is being predicted. Economists face this problem when making economic forecasts. If an economist predicts that the stock market will crash and investors learn of this prediction, they may change their behavior in ways that prevent the crash. Sociologists face this problem when studying social trends. If researchers predict that a particular social movement will grow and people learn of this prediction, they may change their behavior in response. The act of making a prediction about human behavior can change the behavior itself. Information theory reveals another fundamental limit to prediction. To predict the future perfectly, you would need to encode all information about the current state of the universe. This includes not just the positions and momenta of all particles, but also all the information stored in brains, computers, books, and other systems. But here is the problem: encoding that information would itself require energy and space. You would need to create a complete map of the universe to predict what the universe will do. But creating that map would require energy and matter, which would have to come from somewhere in the universe. You would end up with a map that is as complex as the thing it is mapping. This creates a logical impossibility. You cannot have a complete map of the universe that is smaller than the universe itself. Therefore, you cannot encode all the information needed for perfect prediction in any practical way. These principles suggest that perfect prophecy is not merely difficult, but theoretically impossible. Even if someone possessed extraordinary perception, even if they could somehow access information beyond normal sensory channels, the structure of reality itself prevents complete knowledge of future events. The uncertainty principle ensures that we cannot know all the information needed for perfect prediction. Chaos theory ensures that tiny uncertainties grow exponentially over time. Human free will ensures that predictions about human behavior can be self-negating. Information theory ensures that encoding all necessary information is logically impossible. This does not mean that all prediction is impossible. We can make probabilistic predictions. We can say that it is likely that certain things will happen. We can estimate the probability of different outcomes. We can make predictions about average behavior over large populations. But we cannot make perfect predictions about specific future events. We cannot know with certainty what will happen to a particular person in a particular place at a particular time. Notably, this fundamental unknowability of the future applies equally to all would-be prophets. If the future is unknowable in principle, then no amount of special ability or access to hidden knowledge can make it knowable. A prophet cannot overcome the uncertainty principle. A prophet cannot eliminate the sensitivity of chaotic systems to initial conditions. A prophet cannot prevent the self-negating prophecy problem. A prophet cannot encode all the information needed for perfect prediction. The structure of reality itself prevents perfect prophecy. This helps explain why, despite thousands of years of human effort, no one has ever demonstrated genuine prophetic ability in a controlled scientific setting. It is not because prophets lack ability or motivation. It is because the future is fundamentally unknowable. The apparent successes of prophets emerge through the mechanisms we have discussed: vagueness, retrofitting, selective memory, and pattern recognition. These mechanisms create the illusion of prophecy. But the illusion cannot be overcome by genuine foresight, because genuine foresight is impossible. Understanding these scientific principles helps explain why prophecy remains perpetually elusive. It is not because prophets lack ability. It is not because we lack the right measuring instruments or the right methodology. It is because the future's unknowability is built into the fabric of reality itself. The uncertainty principle, chaos theory, human free will, and information theory all combine to create a universe in which perfect prediction is impossible. Any claim to perfect prophecy is not just unproven, but theoretically impossible. This does not diminish the value of attempting to understand the future or to prepare for possible outcomes, but it suggests that we should approach prophecy claims with appropriate skepticism, recognizing that the future will always contain surprises and uncertainties that no prophet can eliminate. As we near the end of our exploration, we now reflect on what our entire journey through the world of prophecy reveals about human nature and our relationship to the future. Prophecy and meaning. What prophecy reveals about human nature. Throughout our journey, we have examined specific prophets, analyzed their predictions, explored the cognitive mechanisms that sustain belief in prophecy, and considered the scientific principles that make perfect prediction impossible. Now, as we approach the conclusion of our exploration, we reflect on what this entire investigation reveals about human nature itself. The persistence of prophecy across cultures and centuries, despite the lack of reliable evidence for its validity, tells us something profound about who we are and how we relate to time, uncertainty, and meaning. The persistence of prophecy reveals something fundamental about human consciousness. We are creatures uniquely aware of our own mortality and the passage of time. Unlike other animals who live primarily in the present moment, humans can contemplate the future, imagine possibilities, and feel anxiety about what might come. We know that we will die. We know that time moves forward and cannot be reversed. We know that the future is uncertain. This awareness creates a psychological burden that other species do not carry. We must live with the knowledge of our own finitude and the unpredictability of what lies ahead. Prophecy offers relief from this burden. It suggests that the future is knowable. It suggests that someone understands what lies ahead. It suggests that we can prepare or find reassurance. In this sense, prophecy is less about accurate prediction and more about managing existential anxiety. A person who believes in prophecy feels less helpless in the face of an uncertain future. They feel that they have some understanding of what will happen. They feel that they can prepare. Even if the prophecy is inaccurate, the comfort it provides while believed is real and valuable. The fact that prophecy persists despite repeated failures suggests that its psychological function matters more than its accuracy. A prophecy that fails can be reinterpreted or forgotten, but the comfort it provided while believed was genuine. The person who received the prophecy felt reassured. They felt understood. They felt less alone. These psychological benefits are real, even if the prophecy itself was not accurate. This does not make prophecy true, but it explains why belief persists. Humans are willing to maintain belief in prophecy because the belief serves important psychological functions, regardless of whether the prophecies are accurate. Prophecy also reveals our deep need for narrative and meaning. Humans are storytelling creatures. We naturally organize our experience into narratives with beginnings, middles, and ends. We look for causes and effects. We want to understand why things happen. We want to believe that events are connected and meaningful, rather than random and chaotic. Prophecy transforms the chaos of random events into a meaningful story. It suggests that history unfolds according to a comprehensible pattern. It suggests that events are not random, but part of a larger design or destiny. This narrative function serves important psychological purposes. A world in which events follow a meaningful pattern feels safer and more understandable than a world in which events are random and meaningless. Prophecy provides this sense of meaningful pattern, even if the pattern does not actually exist. Furthermore, prophecy reflects our ambivalent relationship with the future. We want to know what is coming so we can prepare. We want to reduce uncertainty. Yet we also fear losing the openness and possibility that uncertainty provides. If the future were completely known and predetermined, life would lose much of its meaning and excitement. We would know exactly what would happen. There would be no surprises. There would be no hope for things to turn out better than expected. There would be no possibility of genuine choice. Prophecy offers a compromise between these conflicting desires. It offers the illusion of knowledge without the reality of determinism. We can believe the future is knowable while still experiencing it as open and surprising. We can feel reassured that someone understands what will happen while still maintaining the sense that the future is not entirely predetermined. Finally, prophecy reveals our hunger for transcendence. In a materialist worldview, where humans are merely physical beings subject to physical laws, prophecy suggests the existence of something beyond the material. It suggests consciousness that can perceive beyond normal limitations. It suggests spiritual dimensions or universal knowledge that transcends ordinary human understanding. It suggests that there is more to reality than what we can measure and observe through scientific methods. This metaphysical appeal of prophecy persists even as scientific understanding advances. Even in our modern, scientifically sophisticated world, people are drawn to prophecy because it offers the possibility of transcendence of connection to something larger and more meaningful than ordinary material existence. These various functions of prophecy, managing existential anxiety, providing narrative coherence, offering a compromise between knowing and not knowing, suggesting transcendence work together to create powerful motivation for belief. A person who believes in prophecy is addressing multiple psychological needs simultaneously. The belief is sustained not just by evidence, but by the psychological functions it serves. This helps explain why prophecy persists, despite the lack of reliable evidence. The belief is valuable regardless of its truth value. Understanding this does not require us to dismiss prophecy or those who believe in it. We can recognize that prophecy serves important psychological and social functions while maintaining appropriate skepticism about its accuracy. We can appreciate the human needs that prophecy addresses while acknowledging that these needs can be met through other means as well. We can value the search for meaning and understanding that prophecy represents while recognizing that meaning and understanding can come from many sources: science, art, philosophy, relationships, spiritual practice, and many others. The study of prophecy also teaches us something about human cognition and how our minds work. It reveals the power of pattern recognition, the influence of confirmation, bias, the flexibility of memory, and the human tendency to find meaning in ambiguous information. These cognitive tendencies are not flaws, but features of how human minds evolved to navigate the world. Our pattern recognition abilities help us survive. Our confirmation bias helps us maintain stable beliefs that guide our behavior. Our flexible memories help us learn and adapt. These same mechanisms that help us survive also lead us to see prophecy in ambiguous information and to maintain belief in prophecy despite contradictory evidence. Prophecy endures not because it accurately predicts the future, but because it addresses fundamental human needs for meaning, control, and transcendence. These needs are not going away. As long as humans remain aware of their mortality and the uncertainty of the future, as long as we seek meaning and narrative structure in our experience, as long as we hunger for connection to something larger than ourselves, prophecy will continue to appeal to us. The specific forms that prophecy takes may change. New prophets may emerge. New technologies may be used to spread prophecy claims. But the underlying human needs that prophecy addresses will remain constant. This does not mean we should abandon skepticism or critical thinking. We should continue to examine prophecy claims carefully. We should continue to demand evidence and to point out when predictions fail. We should continue to educate people about the cognitive biases that make prophecy seem more accurate than it is. But we should do this with compassion and understanding for the human needs that prophecy addresses. We should recognize that people who believe in prophecy are not foolish or gullible. They are responding to real psychological and existential needs. They are seeking meaning, control, and connection in a world that often feels chaotic and uncertain. The study of prophecy ultimately teaches us about ourselves. It teaches us about our hopes and fears, our need for meaning, our relationship to time and mortality, and our capacity for both rational thought and irrational belief. It teaches us that we are creatures who desperately want to understand the world and our place in it. It teaches us that we are willing to believe things that make us feel better, even when evidence suggests those beliefs are not accurate. It teaches us that the human mind is remarkable in its ability to find patterns, create meaning, and sustain belief in the face of contradictory evidence. Understanding prophecy helps us understand ourselves. And understanding ourselves helps us approach all our beliefs about prophecy and about everything else with greater wisdom and compassion. Over the past 2 hours and 20 minutes, we have journeyed through one of humanity's oldest and most persistent fascinations, the belief in prophecy. We began by exploring the ancient roots of this practice, tracing how prophecy has appeared across cultures and centuries. We then examined 3 of history's most famous prophets, Nostradamus, with his deliberately obscure Quatrains, Baba Vanga, with her personal readings that spread through oral tradition, and Edgar Cayce, with his meticulously documented readings that offer us rare insight into how prophecy claims develop and persist. We investigated specific predictions attributed to these prophets, comparing what they claimed would happen to what actually occurred. We discovered that the predictions that appear most accurate are often those that are vague enough to apply to many scenarios, or those that were documented only after the events they supposedly predicted. We examined predictions that failed Nostradamus's predicted apocalypses that never materialized Baba Vanga's World War III, that did not begin Edgar Cayce's discovery of Atlantis, that never happened. Yet we also saw how these failures do not damage the prophets' reputations, because failed predictions are forgotten, reinterpreted, or attributed to misunderstanding. What emerges from this exploration is a clear pattern. The apparent accuracy of prophecy emerges not from genuine foresight, but from the mechanisms of human cognition and memory. Pattern recognition leads us to find connections in ambiguous information. Confirmation bias causes us to remember hits and forget misses. Retrofitting allows us to reinterpret vague statements to match subsequent events. These mechanisms operate automatically and powerfully. They make it difficult for even skeptical people to resist seeing prophecy in ambiguous information. We also explored the science of why the future cannot be perfectly known. The uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics, the sensitivity of chaotic systems to initial conditions, the role of human free will, and the logical impossibility of encoding all necessary information for perfect prediction. All of these combine to suggest that perfect prophecy is not merely difficult, but theoretically impossible. Even if someone possessed extraordinary perception, the structure of reality itself prevents complete knowledge of future events. Yet perhaps most importantly, we examined why prophecy persists, despite the lack of reliable evidence for its validity. Prophecy addresses fundamental human needs. It offers the illusion of control in an uncertain world. It provides narrative coherence, transforming random events into a meaningful story. It offers a sense of special knowledge and community. It satisfies our pattern recognition instincts. It addresses our fear of irrelevance and our hunger for transcendence. These psychological functions are powerful and operate at levels below conscious awareness. They make belief in prophecy compelling and persistent, regardless of accuracy. This matters because understanding prophecy helps us understand ourselves. It reveals something profound about human consciousness, that we are creatures uniquely aware of our mortality and the passage of time. It shows us how our brains work, how we search for meaning, how we sustain beliefs even when evidence contradicts them. It demonstrates that we are willing to believe things that make us feel better, even when we know intellectually that evidence is weak. Understanding these patterns helps us approach not just prophecy, but all our beliefs with greater wisdom and compassion. The study of prophecy also reminds us that the human need for meaning and understanding is not something to be dismissed or mocked. People who believe in prophecy are not foolish or gullible. They are responding to real psychological and existential needs. They are seeking comfort in an uncertain world. They are searching for narrative structure in a chaotic universe. These are fundamentally human impulses. Understanding them helps us recognize similar patterns in other beliefs we hold about politics, about health, about the future, about ourselves. As we continue to live in an increasingly complex and uncertain world, as technology transforms how information spreads, and how we understand reality, prophecy will likely continue to evolve. New prophetic figures will emerge online. New predictions will circulate on social media. New technologies will be used to spread prophecy claims. Yet the underlying human needs that prophecy addresses will remain constant. As long as we remain aware of our mortality, as long as we seek meaning and narrative structure, as long as we hunger for connection to something larger than ourselves, prophecy will continue to appeal to us. The journey we have taken together tonight is ultimately a journey into human nature itself. It is a reminder that we are creatures of paradox, rational, yet irrational, skeptical, yet believing, seeking certainty, yet fearing its loss. We are drawn to prophecy, not because it is accurate, but because it fulfills deep needs within us. Understanding this does not require us to abandon critical thinking or skepticism, but it does invite us to approach all beliefs, our own and those of others, with greater compassion and understanding. Thank you for joining this exploration. If you found this worthwhile, there are more stories waiting, more journeys into history, science, and human nature. But for now, rest well. Sleep peacefully, and may you find peace in the knowledge that the future, though uncertain, remains full of possibility. Good night.